Hi.
Okay, now you can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Do you have the ability to share your screen when you need to?
We're gonna find that out right now.
Okay.
Are you seeing my presentation?
Yep.
Good.
Awesome.
And all looks good under these with full screen?
Mm-hmm. Looks great.
Okay, great. Stop sharing. Okay. Thanks. How does it sound? I borrowed these AirPods from Tyler, and I think they're really great, but does it look super weird?
No, it doesn't look weird. It actually looks kind of nice with your outfit.
Good.
It sounds good too. So.
Perfect. That's really the most important thing.
Yeah. I turned my video on, but it's not working for some reason.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
It's fine. As long as you can see, that's all that matters.
It's a nice background too. I like the roses.
My mom cut those fresh from our garden this morning. But yeah, they're quite lovely. It's good. Yeah. I'm excited. I'm painfully nervous, but I think it's gonna be okay.
Everything looks
saying,
great.
Thank
What's
you.
that?
Yeah, I was just asking what you were saying.
Oh, everything looks great. You look perfect. You look very professional.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna kill it. No problem.
Thanks. Thank you, Rick. Hi, Francis. Good morning. Is it still? It's not still light there, is it? Kind of. And I can't hear you. Just so you know, you're probably muted. Yeah. There we go.
Okay. Somebody's taking their mute button off, I think, so.
Yeah, I think that they're going to try and have it so that when everybody comes in, there's not a whole flurry of conversation.
Yeah, good. Sounds good. Okay, fine. Yeah, all right. Hi, Tyler.
Everybody
How you
else.
doing? Greetings from up here in the north. So, it was snowing yesterday, so it's just stopped.
Right. Good. Well, you know, has the snow fully melted yet, even from winter, or is it still just layers?
No, the river's mostly covered in ice. There's just a channel opened up in the middle of it, and
right.
But for the most, there's still 60 centimeters of ice on there.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay.
It's yeah, still a bit. It was cold. I was out walking last night. Also, still quite a cold wind, +2, something like that. So
okay.
Anyway, we won't go too much about the weather. So.
The weather is my favorite part, I think, of all of this, though.
All right. Okay. All right. Great. How are you feeling?
I think I'm feeling good. I slept somehow last night, and I've had, you know, all of my support today, so I'm feeling good.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. So how many of us are going to be in here? Do you know?
I have no idea. Probably a lot. Our community, the PCC program, they tend to be very excited about defenses, and especially now that everyone's in quarantine and we have no social interaction, it seems
nothing
like
else to do. So let's, you know, go and support Laura. No, I didn't mean that. But
exactly.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah. Good. Yeah, good. I'm just getting familiar with these Zoom meetings. Usually I use Skype, but anyway, I understand Zoom is a better platform for more people. So
it is, yeah. At least, I mean, what I've seen, especially now that so many schools have moved online, it's been the default platform that everyone has taken. So
right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. I'm sure the other committee members will be here pretty shortly, and then I think, like Jake said, we'll be starting at 10, and he's going to kind of give an introduction. So.
Fine. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's coming up for 8 o'clock here, as you know.
Oh yeah, so I know.
I didn't realise you were 10 hours ahead. That's quite a way, or behind,
right,
should I say? So.
I think at some point in the year we're only 9 hours difference because something like that happens. So.
Probably in the winter time. Yeah.
Hi, Jake.
Now we're in summer, so. Okay, I'm here at my girlfriend's place, so I'm in her office where it's quiet. So it's nice and colourful in here. So.
You're quarantined with children also, right?
6 weeks.
With a child, yeah. Jake, you're also quarantined with children.
Exactly. Yeah. Good way to learn patience and tolerance.
Yes.
Of course. So.
Okay, I'm gonna get a little organized here.
Program.
What was that?
Hi, Jake.
Hello. Who's?
It's me. It's me.
Oh, great, Ashton.
Ashton. Ashton.
Could be the host.
Could you do me a favor? Could
Yeah.
you give me what's the word I'm looking for?
The host.
Co-host. Yeah, just give me co-host capability in case anything goes wrong. It's nice to have a couple of co-hosts on there so that if anyone gets booted off, they can continue to manage it.
I just did that.
Hi, Laura.
Thank you.
Hi, Brian Swim. I'm so glad you're here. I didn't send you a formal personal invite, but I figured you
Why
would
can't
show
I
up.
hear you?
I don't know. You probably have to unmute.
Maybe this will work. So are you excited?
I am. Yeah,
Oh, good. You can hear.
I can hear you. Can you? And you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, there's echo coming from the other part of my house right now.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Jake. It's Rick.
Laura, do
Hey,
you want
Rick.
me to, do you want me
Hi,
to put
everyone.
my
Hi.
headphones on?
I'm not sure the right way to do it. Sorry.
Laura wouldn't be able, or Evelyn wouldn't be able to hear.
I think maybe if we mute my mom, that would be useful.
I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody
Perfect.
and then unmute folks as we go.
Bye, everyone.
Brian, you're unmuted.
No. Mute me.
If anyone wants to speak, I think you're able to unmute yourself. If you're familiar with Zoom, you just click on the unmute button. I feel like 6 weeks into this, probably everybody's familiar with Zoom. So, Laura, you're unmuted now.
Thank you. We can totally just mute me and I'll just go through the slides and I don't have to say anything. That would be fine. All right. How's Colorado, Jake?
It's very snowy.
Yay!
Yeah,
Good.
it was starting to melt, which was wonderful. It's been really nice when it was melting and we were able to get the children out on bikes and things like that. But now we're covered in snow again. So
yeah,
it's beautiful.
Oh, there you are, Sean. Hi. All right.
Welcome,
We
Sean.
have a committee. We have a quorum.
We'll give it a couple more minutes before we start, just to allow people to arrive.
Sounds good. It also allows me to arrive. Ashton, this is recording, right?
Yes, it is.
Well, shall we get started?
Mm-hmm.
Welcome, everybody, to this wonderful event. It was just a quick word of thanks to all of you for being here and for being here even under conditions that are that make being physically here more difficult than usual. So we're having to do all of our dissertation defenses for the foreseeable future in this format virtually. But one of the great benefits of that is actually a lot of people are able to show up and participate. So it's really wonderful to see all of you here. I now see that I can't see, even on gallery view, I can't see everyone who's in the Zoom room. You're filling it up, and that's really wonderful. I want to say a few words about what we're doing and then introduce the committee that's served on Laura's dissertation before I hand it over to Laura for her presentation today. What we're doing here in this virtual space is something that's been done for centuries. Those of you who've been to other doctoral defenses that I've moderated have heard me talk about the way that doctoral degrees have been awarded for now some 800 years. They first began being given out at the University of Paris. Cambridge and Oxford and other places like that followed a couple decades later. The doctoral degree was an important, it held an important place within the world of the academic hierarchy because the doctoral degree was a terminal degree. It signaled that you'd progressed as far as you could go as a student. You've reached the terminus of your time as a student, and we're now crossing a threshold into something different. You're moving from being a student into the community of scholars and teachers. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were two different terminal degrees. There was a master's degree, the magister, which authorized you to be a teacher. And then there was the doctoral degree, the doctore, which was given in a few disciplines, really, just divinity, law, medicine, sometimes music. To be a magister meant that you could be a teacher because you'd mastered a body of knowledge and some intellectual skills. That's why you called them masters. But to be a doctore meant that you'd not only mastered that body of skills, but you had become a teacher and a generator of knowledge yourself. What Laura has done and what our students in PCC are doing is in continuity with what this tradition has been doing for 800 years, drawing on tools from within philosophy, religious studies, the humanities more generally. Laura's work adds to the collective labor of scholarship and inquiry that's been going on since the birth of the university, and indeed since before the birth of the university, because she seeks to listen to voices and traditions and modes of knowing that have often been marginalized in academic settings as well, traditions with dynamic histories that long precede the university and its 800 years as we know it. But what we in the university have been doing for the last 800 years is not only awarding degrees, but also testing the candidate to see whether they can undergo this initiation and pass through the threshold. Doctoral degrees are awarded in recognition of three things: the creation and interpretation of new knowledge and original research, which is done especially through one's own writing; the acquisition and understanding of a substantial body of knowledge at the forefront of one's own field; and the ability to conceptualize, design, and implement a project for the generation of new knowledge. And that's what we're here to look at today. The dissertation is evidence of the candidate's capacity to conceptualize, design, and implement a project to generate new knowledge that will become part of the collective inheritance of human and maybe more than human conversation, thought, speculation, and exploration of the great mysteries of the universe. So this is not just a PhD defense. It's also a powerful moment in a conversation that's been going on for centuries and that we hope will go on for centuries after us. Now, the three of us who were involved in sitting on Laura's committee will also be called upon to make judgments about what Laura has accomplished later on today. And I want to introduce the three of us just very quickly before handing it over to Laura. We have Dr. Francis Joy, who's a scholar of indigenous religions and history at the University of Lapland Arctic Center, Rovaniemi, Finland. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Francis is the author of a number of texts on the Sámi people and on their religious and spiritual traditions. It's a great privilege to have him joining us today. Professor Sean Kelly You can wave, Sean, if you're there. Is professor here in Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIS. He's the author of Coming Home, The Birth and Transformation of the Planetary Era, co-editor of the variety of integral ecologies, nature, culture, and knowledge in the planetary era, and the co-translator of Edgar Morin's Homeland Earth, a manifesto for the new millennium. Along with his academic work, Sean teaches Tai Chi and is a facilitator of the group process Work That Reconnects, developed by Joanna Macy. And I'm Jacob Sherman, professor of philosophy and religion here at CIS, and chair of the program in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. I taught previously at King's College London and the University of Cambridge, and I'm the author of Partakers of the Divine, Contemplation and the Practice of Philosophy, co-editor of the Participatory Turn, Spirituality, Mysticism, and Religious Studies, and things like that. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Laura Machete to speak to us about divining ecology, the Sámi shaman drum. Thank you all for being here. Here's Laura.
Thank you, Jake, and also for everybody on my committee, Francis and Sean. It's been a wonderful experience of really kind of coming to see what I have to contribute. And so it wouldn't have been possible without you, both of you, all three of you, and so I'm grateful. I'd like to start with two quotes that I think are very important for us to hold as we listen to this presentation. The first one is from Rauna Kokkonen, an Indigenous Sámi scholar, from her essay Towards an Indigenous Paradigm for from a Sámi Perspective. Research, sorry, I'm gonna actually start my timer. Research is deeply implicated in the colonizing process of Indigenous peoples. Not only has it been employed to define what counts as knowledge, but also who counts as human. Similarly, Krem, Martins, and Chalisa in their book Indigenous Pathways into Social Research describe research and the contestation over what counts as knowledge are just as implicated in the marginalization of Indigenous peoples as are Christianity, disease, warfare, and constitutional maneuvering. Good introductions are critical for research like mine that proceeds as best as possible, according to Indigenous research methods. In the words of Indigenous scholar Sean Wilson, relationships don't just shape Indigenous reality, they are our reality. In order for us to begin this presentation, we must first build a relationship. Welcome, and thank you for being here. I'm Laura Machete. I go by the pronouns she, her. I'm a scholar of philosophy and religion. For 20 years, I have studied astrology both as an academic and as a practitioner. I do not ascribe to any particular religion, and I hold a worldview that is best described as enchanted. I was born and raised in urban Southern California, and according to 23andMe, I'm 33% Ashkenazi Jew, 25% Southern Italian, 25% Irish, and some mysterious mix of broadly European for the rest. I am not an Indigenous person. I have 2 daughters. I've never been married. I'm scared of spiders and I love, really love coffee. It's important that you know these things about me because I'm going to share with you intimate details of the life, death, and traditional knowledge of an Indigenous Sámi man named Anders Paulson. And so it seems only fair that I reveal something of myself first, that I don't hide behind the esteem of the title I am pursuing today, Doctor. By way of proper introductions, I would now like to introduce you to the Indigenous community who are the topic of this dissertation, the Sámi. Living around and beyond the Arctic Circle for millennia, the Sámi people are inherently peaceful. There are no weapons to be found among their archaeological artifacts, and there are no notable battles in their histories. Despite this peaceful legacy, the Sámi people, like so many Indigenous communities around the world, experienced a radical and tragic period of colonization and forced Christianization. During this time, described by scholar Rune Hagen as the religious encounter, the Sámi were ridiculed, ostracized, colonized, and in some cases murdered by governmental and religious powers in Norway and the Swedish and Danish kingdoms. The Sámi people, whose territory spans thousands of miles of the Arctic and subarctic regions of modern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of northwest Russia, are the only indigenous community of the European subcontinent today. Sápmi, the indigenous name for Sámi territory, spans the governmental jurisdiction of these 4 different nations, and the Sámi themselves are anything but homogeneous. Spread among 8 distinct regions, Sámi subcultures are distinguishable by linguistic differences, radically diverse geographies, and varied practices of livelihood. There is, however, no doubt of a shared cultural heritage among them, and there is even archaeological evidence that suggests regional inhabitants and cultural continuity going as far back as the last glaciation. The features of this cultural continuity are largely based on the shamanic practices of the ancestors of contemporary Sámi. These practices were related to their subsistence lifestyle as game and reindeer hunters, trappers, and fishers, while the addition of reindeer herding and husbandry in the late Middle Ages further contributed to the development of religiosity and spiritual activity. The primary symbol for the Sámi pre-Christian religious tradition is the shaman drum. Used for a variety of shamanic purposes, including healing, ritualized trance, and divination, the Sámi drum is arguably the most compelling symbol for the mysteries of Sámi culture, and as such, it was also the easiest and most obvious target for the colonizers. During the religious encounter, untold numbers of drums were confiscated and burned, and some were hidden. And in a number of cases, the shaman who owned the drum was killed as well. In 2 cases, we are left with thorough descriptions from the shaman himself about the symbology and use of the shaman drum. My dissertation is a study of one of those drums. I'm going to start a presentation for you for the rest of this. Hopefully, there we go. Okay. Picture the scene. It's February 9th, 1692. A courtroom in Vadsø, Finnmark, the furthest north and furthest east you can get in Europe. The sun graces the land with its presence for about 5 hours a day, and it is minus 20 degrees outside. The courthouse sits along the coast of the Vranger Fjord, and while this keeps the temperature a bit warmer than the interior tundra, the wind and humidity make up for the difference. The medieval courtroom is filled with a jury of both colonial Norwegians and indigenous Sámi. There is a bailiff, a judge, a Sámi translator, and a small audience. In the middle of the room stands an elderly reindeer herder. The court records state he's 100 years old, named Paula Anda. Anders Paulsen is the Norwegianized name. Paula Anda is the North Sámi name. I'll be using them interchangeably. He was arrested in December, and he had been imprisoned for 2 months while awaiting trial for the dubious charge of witchcraft. Scholar Liv Wilhelmsen explains, the only accusation against Anders Paulsen was that he had used the rune drum and thereby practiced the, quote, ungodly art of witchcraft. He had neither been denounced by another person, nor accused of having entered into a pact with the devil, nor accused of any participation at a witch's meeting, nor accused of the deaths of humans or animals, nor accused of causing shipwrecks or being responsible for local disasters, like chasing fish from the shores or destroying the harvest. Sorry, hold on, I've lost my page. What follows in our courtroom scene is a historian's dream. As though written by a dramatist, the court recorder provides a play-by-play narrative of the trial, during which Paula Anda is questioned repeatedly about his shaman drum. Although these court records raise serious concerns about the veracity of a confession given under the threat of death, the narrative of Anders Paulsen's trial is lauded as the most comprehensive description of a historical Sámi shaman drum provided by a Sámi noaidi, or shaman. During his arrest and the court proceedings of the trial, much information came to light regarding Anders Paulsen's life, his identity as a noaidi, and his practices of the noaidi bota. Commentaries on Paulsen's court records, such as those by Rune Hagen and Liv Wilhelmsen, focus on the details of the symbols, Paulson's often confusing messaging, and the all too obvious unreliability of courtroom testimonies when the wrong answer is punishable by death. These commentaries speak to the complexities of the religious encounter and reveal the ways in which the Sámi were woven into larger religious persecutions that were rampant across Europe during the 17th century. However, there is not much research that looks at the material at face value for what it is, namely, a live divination done by an experienced practitioner who, if we are to follow scholar Barbara Tedlock's advice and take what diviners say and do seriously, may have been all too aware of the fate that awaited him. Before we can proceed, it's time for another introduction, this time to the Sámi drum. A ritual object used for hunting and healing, as well as for divination. The Sámi drum looks like many other handheld drums from around the world. It is most often made of pine, can be either a frame shape or carved, like this one, out of a wooden burl, and fastened around the frame is a reindeer skin, upon which symbols are painted with a red-hued alderbark mixture. The symbols, though prevalent throughout Sápmi, are arranged in patterns specific to the region where the drum comes from. And although there are significant overlaps in pattern, symbol placement, or symbol presence, no two drums are identical. The diversity in terms of the symbolic layout is a testament to the individualized nature of each noaidi. The drum is an extension of the shaman. It's arranged as a reflection of both the inner and outer world, a cosmic map of ecology and consciousness. Anders Paulsson's drum is believed to have been from Utsjoki, a small town in the far north of Finland, and it is the only one of its kind. Specifically, it's the only drum with symbols divided among 5 layers. When compared with the drums of the southern type, such as this, which are characterized by a central sun rhomboid with orbiting circles, or the Lule and Kemi drums that are richly inhabited and teeming with life, Paulsson's drum simply looks different. It is more austere, with horizontal lines and little vertical lines that create a grid-like structure, and the drum portrays more anthropic figures than animals, unlike many of the other shaman drums. My dissertation is a study of the embedded and embodied knowledge of Anders Paulsson's drum. As an archaeological artifact, Anders Paulsson drums serves as a time capsule that captures a key moment in Sámi history. As a religious object, the drum preserves memory of a spiritual worldview that was, by the time of Paulsson's life, already waning. As a living canon of traditional ecological knowledge, the Sámi drum is a symbol for sustainable thinking. This is both on account of the way in which the drum has been historically recognized as a symbol for Sámi culture, but also how the drum's symbolism is intimately linked to traditional ecological knowledge that is embedded in the rock art and landscape of Sápmi. By examining the ecological, cosmological, and divinatory symbolism of Anders Paulsson's drum, my research shows how the connection between spirituality and sustainability is, and has long been, of primary importance to Sámi culture. As we delve deeper into the Sámi drum, we are faced with perhaps the most exciting introduction of all, the symbols. It would not be too much to state that the extent of the Sámi people's cosmology and ecological knowledge exists painted on the surface of the shaman drum. From the sundry symbols, distinct themes emerge. Cosmological motifs like star constellations and mythic spirits, ecological motifs like earthly animals and places of sacrifice. Sámi scholar Elina Hellander-Renvall explains, knowledge about a human being's, a single individual's place in relation to his or her community and the environment, and in fact, the entire universe, is embedded in traditional knowledge. These relations are expressed in old Sámi drum pictures, for instance. In order to understand the knowledge of the Sámi, one has to study it in the context of their activities, such as reindeer herding, trapping, and fishing. Furthermore, it is important to consider their beliefs and relation to nature. Such knowledge is traditionally expressed through stories, songs, memorized experiences, and so on. Hellander-Renvall's charge is an important one, and there is plenty of research about the Sámi people in the context of their daily lives. The drum, however, is often studied out of the one significant context in which it was used. In addition to its use in rhythm and healing and shamanic rituals, the Sámi drum was also used as a tool for divination. In order to understand the drum fully, historically, symbolically, ecologically, it must be examined within the context of divination. As a diviner, I am especially well prepared to revisit the court records of Anders Paulsson's arrest and trial with an eye toward the divinatory aspects revealed therein. I have studied and practiced divination systems like the I Ching, tarot cards, and, as I previously mentioned, astrology. Depending on the audience, this fact of my positionality could be seen as a weakness or a flaw, an inability to extract myself from the research sufficiently to provide objective scientific commentary. I must admit my biases are undeniable, but my skills are useful. In an effort to align my methodology with the objects of my study, in other words, to choose the right tool for the job, this entire research project might be thought of as a sustained divination itself. But where some cast lots or draw natal charts, I have used the tools of scholarship as my divinatory implements. I will now present some of the findings from that approach. This next portion is going to be broken into 3 sections. I'll be discussing tiny bits of my entire dissertation just to give you a taste, and I will address ecological matters, cosmological matters, and divinatory matters. So as early as the 12th century in the Icelandic Eddas and the Historia Norvegae, there is mention of sorcerers in the north who had a powerful connection to the forces of nature. The land itself was foreboding, rumored, quite accurately, to be wrapped in continued darkness and buried under ice and snow. These sorcerers, among them we can safely assume were the Sámi, were dubious individuals, were, quote, dubious individuals whose magical conjuring was reputed to be strong enough to control the forces of chaos. In other words, they could control or raise the sea at will, end quote. By the end of the 16th century, the extent of the Nordic sorcerers' powers over nature expanded to include weather magic. Weather magic was primarily depicted in the practice of selling wind knots, lengths of rope or leather with knots tied to them, which, when unfurled, would promise favorable, strong winds for sailors. While certain of the sources make specific reference to the Sámi people, the craft of wind magic seems to have been widely attributed among inhabitants in the far north. During the 17th century witch hunts in Finnmark, both Sámi and Norwegian people would be accused, tried, and even executed for their so-called diabolic sorcery, and well over 100 cases are recorded from this tragic century in the north. In his testimony, Paulsson addresses weather magic through a number of symbols that relate to the deities believed to indicate good and bad weather. There's a symbol of the moon on the drum, and of it he says, when the moon god is worshipped, I have to get rid of Zoom to do this, it shines brightly and the nocturnal weather will be fine even if there is a heavy cover of clouds. The act of divination with the drum would reveal the weather forecast. But even more interesting, Paulsson makes mention of his son Christopher, who, quote, learned from a stone about the imminent bad weather in the year 86, when many people drowned in the east. Christopher, Paulsson's son, had forbade people to leave the shore that day, but his warnings were not heeded and many people drowned. Although it is interesting to reflect on the lack of belief held by many in the community, a fact which allows us to glimpse into the extent to which the local community was already shifting from a pre-Christian shamanic spirituality into a Christian worldview, the ecologically significant piece of this story is how divinatory prophecy supported aggregation of climate knowledge. Prophecy is unique in its ability to act as historical memory. The validation of a prophetic statement through events in the real world has the effect of intensifying a memory and thus making it more likely to be carried down through generations. Preserving memory in an oral culture is a difficult task. Many cultures have complex epic poetry and storytelling that contain within them historical and mythic information. For the Sámi, this information is embedded in the natural environment and in the symbolism of the drum. The historical memory of Christopher's prophecy provides scientific data about weather patterns and ecologically significant events. That these knowledges are embodied in the practice of shamanism reveals one of the ways in which shamanism has proved useful for long-term stewardship of the natural world, as well as provided adaptability for the inhabitants of the volatile environment of the Arctic. Moving into cosmology now, I'll talk about the sun and the moon symbols a little further. Cosmology encompasses more than just metaphysical worlds, and indeed speaks to the temporal experience of human life within a given worldview. Temporality remains a key interest for divination, and as such is a worthy topic of consideration in my dissertation. A large part of the divinatory process is looking toward outcomes. Parsed for human endeavors, this often means telling the future. And as such, many divinatory systems contain within them methods for telling the timing of events to come. There's no way to know whether Paulson's drum included this particular component, but there are a few indicators that suggest it's a possibility. In rows 2 and 4, as you can see in front of you, there are two dominant symbols, a circle and a circle with a vertical median line. These symbols are said by Paulson to be the sun and the moon, though there is some ambiguity regarding which is which. The ambiguity combined with reports of shamans orienting their drum in different directions for different purposes or at different times in the year, a practice which is of course also captured in the testimony itself, strongly suggests that the drum is capable of being read according to not just seasonal, but daily rhythms. The drum is relied on for telling the best times to depart on a hunt or to begin a sea journey, and also for the timing of rituals and sacrifice. It would follow then that the symbols of the drum might provide clear indications of timing. How might this be? In the third row, the row that would typically be associated with the realm of human life, are three figures described by Paulson as the days of Christmas. Named after the numbers 1, 2, and 3, these figures are likely candidates for symbols of a numerical value. One possibility then is that the Noaidi would orient the drum with the sun facing a certain direction, for example, north, and proceed drumming. If the vorbi, or the little ring that they set on top of the drum, danced across one of the Christmas days, this could be interpreted as a numeric value in terms of a solar calculation, perhaps monthly. However, if the drum was rotated to have the moon facing the same direction, for example, north, any indication of number could refer to a lunar calculation, namely days. Although this conjectural exercise is not intended to provide a verifiable answer, but rather to invite new ways of thinking with the Paulson drum, it is clear that Paulson did believe the Christmas days to be a very effectual part of his divinatory practice. He says that, quote, "If anybody defiles these days, God will punish that person. But if somebody honors them and then prays to God for something, then these days are exhibited to God, and it will be submitted that so-and-so has honored the days, and God will help for that very reason." Ultimately, it's not possible to know what Paulson was capable of or inclined to do with his drum. However, to ignore the potential for the Sámi drum to be a sophisticated and complicated divinatory tool would be to inadvertently assume that the Sámi did not have the same impulses, desires, needs, and wherewithal as the majority of people from other cultures who practice divination. This to me would be a gross misconception, and I proceed with a commitment to theorize the drum to be as complicated a system of prediction as astrological star charts, Sakidi layouts from Madagascar, and of course the many hundred parable system of Ifa divination. Moving on to the divinatory aspects. In order to highlight the performance, indeed the unavoidable, the importance, indeed the unavoidable primacy of the divinatory use of the Sámi shaman drum, I now turn to the court testimony to survey the parts of the narrative that refer to divination either in symbolic representation, theory, or actual practice, all three of which are present in no short supply within the text. According to the court records, Paulson used his drum for the following: the lifting of spells and sending them back to whoever cast them, castigating a thief and punishing him, for acquiring luck with reindeer and to preserve the reindeer from death by wolves, helping women in confinement, pregnancy, childbirth, how people are faring when they are far away, and for simply answering a question. In three places, Paulson is described as demonstrating the techniques associated with many of these activities. Examining these three instances enhances our understanding of the practice of drum divination in the Sámi pre-Christian tradition, but also highlights the parts of Paulson's testimony and trial that bespeak his experience as a diviner and potential authenticity. The first indication that Paulson is in fact performing an active divination is his comment referencing the house of a Norwegian. I'm going to quote Rune Hagen at length here, and it's going to sound a little bit similar for the story that I already told you. On a winter day early in 1692, Sámi and Norwegians present at legal proceedings in Vadsø would have been in for a very extraordinary experience. Not only local officials, but the whole court and common people of the county seat paid close attention as an older Sámi walked over to the table in the courtroom, picked up the drum sitting on the table, made the sign of the cross before himself over the instrument, and read a silent prayer in Karelian. Weeping, and with the most profound devotion, he then held up the drum and played it so everyone could see how the Sámi runic drum was used. He beat it with the hammer, making the cover dance up and down along with his hard beating of the drumhead. After having kept up the drumming for a while, he told the court tribunal that the gods could not agree whether or not to answer. The gods were skeptical about the invocation coming from, quote, the house of a Norwegian. He called out loud to the spirits, saying they need not fear the Norwegians. Even though he was playing in a Norwegian house, the Norwegians meant him no harm, he said before he went on playing. Applying the lens of phenomenological hermeneutics to this statement with an eye toward the divinatory method, I propose that while Paulsen was drumming, the brass ring moved in such a way as to indicate two things: his location in a Norwegian courtroom and a reluctance on the part of the drum, on the part of the gods, to respond. Divination systems contain within them contraindications to answers, usually in the form of responses from the medium itself that suggest an answer is either not possible or incorrect. While there is no way to know which symbol prompted this response, we should take Paulsen's comment about the gods being skeptical as a clear indicator to us that he was, in fact, engaging in a divinatory moment, and that his descriptions of the symbols were, in fact, accurate for that particular moment in his life. Considering the ecological significance of the Sámi drum shows us how specific symbols can take on a multitude of meanings depending on temporal and spatial context. The Sámi drum can be read as a map of both the inner world of the shaman as well as the various layers of the so-called material realm. As such, it can be superimposed onto any external situation. The outer world, like the drum, is animated through time and interaction. Where an untrained eye sees a static landscape or a courtroom, there is in fact a stage upon which any number of symbolic and meaningful occurrences can be performed. The diviner, as a trained witness, interprets these messages not according to a set rubric, but rather to the infinitely overlapping qualities of any given moment. What for Anders could represent the direction of the nearest church were he wandering in the deep tundra of Finnmark may, in a Norwegian courtroom, come to signify the very place in which he is standing. I want to take one deep breath. When Anders Paulsen's trial adjourned on February 10th, 1692, no final verdict or sentence had been passed. Although the judge had clearly determined that Paulsen was guilty of the charges of witchcraft and had also decided that these charges were so grievous that it was necessary to, quote, make an example, end quote, of Paulsen with severe punishment, the claims against him were too obscure to provide a clear sentencing. The court decided to send the records of the trial to the district court in Copenhagen in order to get an official order on how to proceed with sentencing. The court records pick up again on February 22nd, this time to address charges against a man named Willem Gundersen, the murder of Anders Paulsen. On the night of February 11th, 1692, the day following his trial, Anders Paulsen was murdered while he slept. A man named Willem Gundersen, a hired hand who worked for Hans Lillienskold, the presiding deputy of Paulsen's case, had struck Paulsen in the head 3 times with an axe. Paulsen was being held without bondage, meaning he wasn't tied down, at Lillienskold's residence while the courts awaited a response from Copenhagen. Throughout the records of the court case of Willem Gundersen, we learn that those in the local community considered Willem a madman. He's described as a demented, rueful man who had several times, quote, run around like a madman without clothes, and had even, quote, been tied up because of his lunacy. Ultimately, this history of insanity would save Gundersen's life. The judge determined that due to the, quote, demented state of feebleness, end quote, that Gundersen was in when he murdered Paulsen, he could not be sentenced to death. Gundersen was instead ordered to pay a fine and no recourse was offered, to Paulson's children, 3 of who were present at the murder trial. It is interesting to note that although there is no explicit word that the court had received a verdict from Copenhagen, Paulson is described as having, quote, forfeited his body to be burnt at the stake, end quote, and he stood accused of witchcraft and idolatry. The records even claim that Paulson, quote, evaded his execution, end quote, on account of having been murdered. This all goes to show the severity of the accusation of witchcraft. From the court records, one thing is certain. Paulson did not consider himself a witch or a devil worshiper, and he is recorded as repeatedly expressing respect for and faith in the Christian God. Paulson's use of the drum was to him a traditional healing practice and a way to improve life for himself and his community. Williamson explains, the whole range of words used by Anders Paulson shows that he not only looked on the use of the rune drum as related to curing and healing, but that he included something wider when he was talking about the rune drum's doctorship. The rune drum's ability to give answers when questions are posed, so to speak, the rune drum's ability to enable him to function as an oracle. Although from our vantage point, nearly 4 centuries later, Paulson's innocence is obvious. The Norwegian courts were not persuaded, and even though he was spared the gruesome death of burning at the stake, Paulson still lost his life on account of the accusations and subsequent trial. Magical object, historical artifact, living symbol, Paulson's drum is first and foremost an extension of Paulson himself. That it was spared from the fires that day is a gift to his legacy, which is, in one way, forever tangled with the story of his ultimate death. But in another more subtle, and dare I say mystical way, Paulson's drum can bring to light much about his life and spirituality. If one focuses on the court testimony alone, which would be a reasonable thing to do in following traditional academic research practices, Paulson could either be seen as an accused criminal or the victim of barbaric witch hunts in the Middle Ages. But by thinking with Anders Paulson's drum, we have been able to divine a man. There are many questions that are left unanswered in this tale, lacuna that exist even within the well-preserved records. Did Anders Paulson know he was going to die? Was Willem Gunderson acting from psychosis or something more nefarious? How long was it before Paulson's wife found out about her husband's passing? These questions have no answers and will forever remain unknown, but in this mystery we are invited to imagine the inner world of the characters we have encountered. Just like a well-seasoned diviner, we have intuitions and instincts that guide us toward, if not understanding, then perhaps compassion. Killing the protagonist is a challenging move for any storyteller to make, and yet in history, it is all too often the case that our greatest heroes are made martyrs. In the case of Anders Paulson and his shaman drum, it would be easy to focus on the court records, the artifact of the drum, the drama of it all, and to proceed to my own concluding remarks, to the end of this story, with nary a pause to reflect on the feeling of it all. But ultimately, a man was murdered, and there is no research method or proven thesis that justifies this tragic outcome. How then does a researcher find the space to grieve? In his book, The Wounded Researcher, Robert Romanishin suggests that research is a process of psychological unfolding for the researcher, and that by maintaining engaged awareness of soul, the researcher can both identify and heal their own psychological trauma through the act of research. As a result of this psychological approach to research, Romanishin describes how the process can unfold in organic and surprising ways. It's a quote. In working on this book, I am being worked on, and at times even being worked over. Thus, the content of this book is also its process. The Wounded Researcher is a direct expression of what it proposes. A work chooses one as much as one chooses it. And there is always that gap between what one says and what haunts one as wanting to be said. As described in this quote, research is not always conducted by the researcher. Rather, the material itself is both pursued and likewise lures the researcher toward its core. What started for me as a vision to study the correspondences between divination and ecology across the world ultimately revealed itself to be the building of a deep relationship with a group of people, be it via the life and death of a single man. Rather than assuming the role of mastermind, I became a character in my own research journey. And by acknowledging my own presence in the work and in the world of those I've learned with, I have had the opportunity to connect with the work heart to heart, soul to soul. It is as a soul, then, that I can find space to grieve for the loss of this elder shaman, and it is as a soul that I invite you to mourn as well. Ramanujan describes how all research is a way of remembering, and as such is a way of acknowledging that which has been lost. He explains how this aspect of research is, in a way, an act of grieving. Another quote, mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning, then, is not just the experience we have after loss. On the contrary, mourning is natural to soul. It is the way of soul, the soul's way of knowing and being. The activity of soul that challenges the ego mind to hold on to what it possesses by letting go of it. In a poetics of the research process, the ego is not the center of work. The work is not in the researcher, any more than a dream is within the dreamer. By allowing oneself, one's soul, to be present in the research process, we are invited to engage with our research topic with more parts of ourself. This in turn creates a space wherein the wholeness of the other is also welcome into the learning space, creating more authentic understanding and building personal relationships. This practice of relationship building is a key piece of Indigenous research methodology in order to avoid the pitfalls of colonial research practice. By building relationships with Indigenous community members, the researcher displays respect for and interest in the lived experience of community members. Although it is not possible to closely connect with all members of an Indigenous community, creating significant relationships with the necessarily limited circle one does engage with enriches the research process and results in studies that give back to the community. This ultimately creates stronger Indigenous communities who can work with researchers that are allies and friends rather than experts and authorities. As we near the end of this presentation, there is yet another introduction to be made, this time to the wider community of scholars, researchers, spiritual practitioners, and Indigenous peoples who have, like the Sámi, crafted a worldview around ecological flourishing. Building relationships within communities translates into building bridges beyond communities. Utilizing research methods that can connect Indigenous communities to each other and to other cultures ultimately encourages the kind of dialogue that will be necessary as humanity navigates our current climate crisis. Time and again, it has been shown that Indigenous populations are far better at stewarding the natural environment of their Indigenous land than are colonial powers who often seek to exploit resources and, as a result of displacement and cultural degradation, people as well. The scientific ecological movement is caught somewhere in the middle of these conflicts, often supporting worldviews that discourage listening to the voices of shamans or elders or glaciers, despite sharing similar goals with Indigenous communities, namely a robust and healthy natural world. Building knowledge that can translate between the worldviews of Indigenous people and the powerful authorities is the only way forward. To this end, I believe the best way to translate the world of the Sámi people to a non-Indigenous audience of philosophers, researchers, ecologists, and students of religion and spirituality is to show the way in which the Sámi worldview aligns with the principles of other spiritually ecological cultures. In other words, how is the Sámi Noiti Bota a religious ecology? Grimm and Tucker explain that religious ecologies can be understood as supporting a worldview in a fourfold way. Religious ecologies can be seen then as ways of orienting humans to the universe, grounding them in the community of nature and humans, nurturing them in Earth's fecund processes, and transforming them into deeper cosmological selves. Grimm and Tucker go on to connect these four positions, orienting, grounding, nurturing, and transforming, with the four elements of air, earth, water, and fire. By aligning their research structure with a cosmological perspective, Grimm and Tucker demonstrate the richness of a thinking with approach. Religious theory becomes an embodied experience, and ecological inquiry becomes embedded within the inseparable worlds of cosmos and nature. The Sámi drum is most especially a tool for orientation. Providing cosmological and geolocational context, the drum tells people where they are in space, time, and in relationship to the spirit world. The drum is grounding by way of its service aspect. Used as a tool to support community efforts and individual healing, the drum provides stability in the face of external uncertainty. The drum is nurturing to both the humans and spirit worlds. By aligning with the knowledge of the cosmos, as expressed through the drum in divination or trance, people are nourished in the form of successful hunts, protected reindeer, and appropriate medicines for a host of ills. But also, by beating the drum and visiting with the spirits, the Noaidi provides nurturance to the many realms of ancestors and deities who support life on Earth. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the drum is transforming in its power to guide traveling souls between worlds, to heal ancestral wounds, and to protect cultural heritage through ages of change. Viewed in this way, then, as a holistic symbol for cultural ecology, the Sámi drum is a worthwhile historical and contemporary object of study, creation, and admiration. Contemporary Noaidi Frederick Prost says, "When you, as a Sámi, pick up the drum and strike it, then you erase 300 years of colonization, one strike at a time." Colonization has been a painful process for the Sámi people, not only in terms of cultural heritage or language and lifestyle loss, but also in terms of the ecological degradation of the Arctic environment wherein they live. Erasing colonization is a way of reclaiming land rights and thereby reestablishing the health and balance of the local environment of Sápmi. By engaging with the spiritual wisdom of their ancestors through drum divination and other practices of the Sámi Noaidi Vota, the Sámi can lead the way toward healthful environmental stewardship of the Arctic. One last photo. This is Utsjoki, Finland, so it's the same place, presumably according to what we know, where Anders Paulsson's drum came from. So that's the end of my presentation. Let me try and get out of here. Stop sharing. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So just to give a little bit of orientation for how this is going to proceed now, the dissertation committee will ask Laura the questions that have arisen for us through reading her dissertation or listening to this presentation. So we can draw, we may be drawing questions either from the reading of the text or from what Laura has shared with us this morning. And we'll continue to cycle through that. I'll get it started so the other two can have some time to collect their thoughts. And then I'll pass it over to Francis and then to Sean, and then we'll keep cycling for as long as the committee feels like we need to keep questioning. And then after that, the committee will retire to a Zoom room that I'll create that will be just for the committee. And during that time, while we're off deliberating amongst ourselves, you all will still be here in the big giant Zoom room with Laura, and we'll be able to ask her questions and interact with her and so forth. And then eventually we'll return, okay? So let me get it started, Laura. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was rich and engaging and dramatic and insightful. Just really evokes a powerful sense of both your own relationship to this material and how important it has been for you and how important it could be for the larger conversations in which we're all a part. I have a number of different areas I'd like to, a number of different things I could ask you about it, but I think I'll start with a question about methods, I guess. When I try to think about your dissertation and what you've done, it's been transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary, and you've drawn on lots of different methods, but if there's an overall field in which it seems maybe to fit, one way to describe it would almost be that it's a work within the field of comparative religions. You're focused on the Sámi, but there's comparison going on throughout, comparison to divinatory practices in classical antiquity or in contemporary world. You draw on comparative scholarship, Eliada's scholarship about shamanism and things of that sort. So here's I think the question I want to ask. Throughout the 20th century, comparativism really flourished, especially following Eliada's model, and then was met with increasing skepticism on the part of a lot of scholars. Some often because they felt that similarities were being given too much, were being prioritized too much to the neglect of differences between things being compared. And that can have the effect of then eliding difference and suppressing difference, which, as has often been pointed out, can serve colonial and imperialistic ends, right? So how is it that your use of comparative tools how is your use of comparative tools avoiding that that sort of neo-colonial flattening of differences when looking at Sámi divination in the context of larger schools of divination, and also when looking at sort of Sámi, the sort of Sámi religious ecology or spiritual ecology within the context of those larger discussions? Okay, that's my question.
Okay, that's a good and big question. So it's going to have a good and big answer as well. I'll start by saying that for me, the presentation, right, is a tiny piece of the dissertation. And the dissertation is really a tiny piece of the bigger experience of transformation and the journey that I went on to get to that place. And so although the dissertation itself is primarily based in a kind of comparative methodological framework, that also looks at a sort of literary criticism. I literally look at a text of about 40 pages of court records and analyze it. And then I also, like you are pointing out, kind of do a comparative analysis of the religious practices, divination, with the Sámi and other cultures. But those are the kind of final products. And I actually collected the research in different ways. The research was collected according to indigenous research methodologies, in which I really went on quite literal journeys to the Arctic. I interviewed shamans. And I think, and through that process gained a body of knowledge and a way of understanding the culture that helped me make the decisions that I made to do the comparative analyses. Now, separate from that, I just want to say, I think that the key feature of, or the key problematic feature of comparative analyses is when you lose identity in a comparison. That's not a necessary requirement for comparisons. It's more a necessary part of colonial research endeavors and colonialism in general. I know that there are indigenous people who want to build those bridges. They want to feel connected. So one of, I sort of asked one of the shamans at one of the, during one of my interviews on one of my adventures in Sámi, and kind of asked about, do you look at different divinatory systems in order to really kind of connect with your own personal one? And for them, it was absolutely. And I think that it's safer, and this is conjecture in my own personal opinion. I'll speak a little bit more, but my understanding is that it's more reliable to seek out the wisdom of other indigenous cultures who practice divination rather than to totally rely on missionary sources or the sort of, the what is the word? The recounting of activities from people who don't actually believe in divination. And so I'm assuming that that has something to do with the reasoning behind being able to build bridges that are safer, really, because ultimately there was a certain bit of loss that happened specifically with the divinatory part of the shaman drum. And in contemporary times, it is being sort of rebuilt as a system by the Sámi people. And one of the resources that they do use themselves, aside from really wonderful shamanic activities, they also look to other cultures that are similar in worldview. And so I think it's really a matter of ensuring that there's a worldview kind of compatibility, and that the comparisons are not to lose identity. You can maintain separate identities, but find a harmony with the other. And so that's sort of what I had hoped to do. I believe I succeeded in that. And I think that you know, ultimately that is a much better way of doing it than, you know, sort of like I was saying, kind of being an authority and saying, well, I think it looks like this. It's more just, here's all the ways it could look. What do you think? And that's sort of what this dissertation is an offering of that option. That's it.
Thanks. Thanks
Yeah.
for that, Laura.
Of course.
Let me pass it on. I have more questions to ask, but I'll hold them in my back pocket for a moment.
Okay.
Francis, would you like to go next? I'm unmuting you, I think. There we go.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Jacob. Greetings. Good evening, everybody from Northern Finland. And thank you. It's great to be on this really wonderful occasion. And congratulations, Laura, on bringing you to all the work that you've done to bring you to this point. And it's been very, very fascinating to read the work that you've done, the research that you've done, and also to listen to your presentation this evening. And so I want to congratulate you on that and say it's a very unique and interesting field that you've decided to go on. And also, you know, if I can just add before I get to the questions, I want to say that if you can hear me, I don't know, I keep getting these messages that you can, good, okay. Yes. But you know, what you described reminds me how researcher becomes detective, investigator, and you know, that really and that's the role that we take, I think, you know, and trying to piece together without any forensic labs or anything like that. We only have stuff to read and people to talk to, and try and pick up all these bits and put them together and make some sort of sense. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to say that I think where your part as a diviner comes into this is like it's filled a really important gap in research that although you're not an insider from an indigenous perspective, but because of the professionalism and the work that you do, you've been able to step into a place where there's been this gap and start looking around in there and, you know, get your magnifying glass out and get your brush out and piece things together. And the results of what you've done, what you've been presented today, and for that, there's credit due, you know, really, really amazing.
Thank you.
And so coming down to the research questions, as you know, we've been busy these last couple of days sorting through stuff. And one of the things that came to mind when I was reading your paper, especially that so I think what my questions are really focused around are about the research methodologies and the approaches that we used. But one of the things that came to mind was that interviewing the Sámi people in itself was a research method, was a method. I don't recall seeing that written, but I wanted to say that, you know, in that way, a new approach and somehow combining that with Western, the phenomenological hermeneutic approach. So you've got a kind of a nice mixture there. And I think that's really what we're looking, what indigenous people are looking for, and also Western researchers are about bringing Western research methods, which some people have really scorned upon them, and then indigenous research methods and showing how science and traditional knowledge can learn from each other and what they've got to teach. And somehow I really saw that in what you'd written. And, you know, and I think the reason I'm talking about it is because sometimes the work that we might be doing is we're unconscious to what we're doing. But I really saw that. I saw that in your research. And so in relation to the questions about that, the question that I have about that is that, you know, did you get what kind of responses did you get from the Sámi people, and the responses that you got from them, how did those help you to formulate these research methods that you've chosen to use in your dissertation?
Thank you for asking that. And it sets me up perfectly for some things that have really kind of become clear as I've been preparing, to kind of close this chapter ultimately is what's happening. And I mean, and I'm going to open a whole bunch of new ones, but so what I realized, and I'm going to go back to kind of the conclusion part of my presentation, wherein I talk about the sort of wounded researcher and essentially the way in which we don't really guide research. And for me, that was especially true. This project underwent many transformations, and really, ultimately, it wasn't so much transformation as it was a narrowing in of focus. And so when I was beginning my research, I was doing a lot of a kind of autoethnographical survey. I was interviewing people, I was exploring the field, I was trying to understand how it related, how the Sámi Nuadibota was still alive today. I wanted to understand that. And I was I had the wonderful, big, huge plan of incorporating all of that into a kind of assessment of 4 different drums. And what ended up happening was that Anders Paulsson's drum and his life and the court records really decided that they wanted to be the main show. And so essentially I ended up kind of re-evaluating my practices. And in order to write a dissertation specifically about what is more or less a historical document, I ended up having to really focus in on these more comparative methods that Jake asked about. Now, with that said, I did do field work and I did interview people and I did learn a lot about the Nuadibota tradition. And I think that the ways that that helped me and informed me are in some ways incomprehensible. I know that what I expected, assumed, understood to be the truth about the Sámi tradition when I first started studying has become so much more complicated, real, and also human as a result of the field work and the interviews that I did. And so there's a way in which I would say, and I think that this is ultimately one of the best case scenarios and one of the perhaps reasons to follow Indigenous research methods, where you ask people their opinions, where you ask them what they want to know about and what they think about what you're thinking about, where it's more of a dialogue than a kind of a rapid fire interview. So I think the benefit of that in the best case outcome would be that I really began to see the ways in which I had projected so much onto this tradition, onto the practitioners of it historically and contemporarily. And in sitting in space with these people, sharing a cup of coffee, taking a hike, I really did come to see the similarities, the humanness. And so I think that that would be the first kind of major piece of what the interviews did. And that was, it took away any of the kind of idealization that I may have had going into it. And that was invaluable. And I don't even know that it could be quantified. And it allowed me to remain open and curious. And also, most importantly, because although I did interview some contemporary shamans, I also hung out with very secular or Christian reindeer herders. And I talked to teenagers and people who really weren't within the field of shamanism. And so I learned that especially, in terms of like kind of popping those illusion bubbles that I may have had going into it, that there isn't actually, like I said, one way to be a Sámi. They're immensely diverse sort of culture of humans, even amongst shamans and amongst people who are not interested in the pre-Christian tradition. There's just so much diversity and humanity. And so I think that the field work that I did, the interviews with contemporary shamans, the weird interactions I had at like the gas station in Inari, all of those sort of confirmed different experiences that made me feel at once more comfortable, but also a little more reverent, because I was seeing people as they are rather than how I had envisioned or imagined them to be. I think that's the best. Would you like something different after that? I feel like that's kind of a broad answer, so where I'm going.
That's great, Laura. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, the other descendants of those people that were put to death around they're living today in Finland, in Sweden, and Norway, and what I thought about when I got to the end of the dissertation yesterday was that, has there been any feedback within the Sámi community about how you've maybe represented the history or represented the voices of the people that you interviewed? Because again, you know, as researchers, that's what it's such an arduous task.
Right.
But what came to mind was that in my own experience, you know, of interviewing somebody I met two relatives of a man here in Finland who was given a death sentence around the same time as Anders Paulsen.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and there were 12 generations down from this man. And it made me think about, you know, the very similar parallel to what you've written about and what you've done, that there's that additional consciousness, if you want to say, or additional burden that we're tasked with when we're doing this research, is to somehow, as outsiders, to come to a place where we can represent them in a you know, in the best possible way. And I wondered whether or not you'd had any comments or feedback about that from anybody.
Right. Well, and it's, you know, unfortunately, I was not able to come in contact with any of Anders Paulsen's direct descendants, and obviously nor him. And so, there is a disconnect there. But I definitely, anytime that I communicated or interviewed and approached and used literally the words of Indigenous scholars or Indigenous people, there was constant, probably too much communication going on about, this is what I'm going to say about what you said. Is this correct? And there was a dialogue that was always happening. And I think this speaks to kind of the thing that I was bringing up in the beginning, Sean Wilson's concept of building relationships, and how that's such a critical piece of Indigenous research. And so, yes, not only did I ask multiple times, you know, once, you know, have I represented you correctly? But multiple times, sort of digging deeper to try and find out what it is that somebody actually wants to be represented as. And also, as a result of I think what ended up happening as I focused more and more on Paulsen's drum and realized that I don't have access to Paulsen, I used less and less of the interview material very intentionally. And that was because I had developed specific relationships that I felt very comfortable communicating with and putting their words out there. And those are the ones that really did make it into the dissertation. So there's a combination of both. Yes, it happened in some cases, probably annoyingly so much. But then in other cases, you know, there wasn't that rapport or that long-term relationship built. And so those messages did not get put into the dissertation. And that doesn't mean that that's not something that will be a further kind of developed relationship in the future. It's just in the context of this project is how it turned out.
Okay, that's my couple of questions for now. Back to you, Jacob. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you, Francis.
Thanks, Francis. Sean, I'll hand the mic over to you, metaphorically.
Okay, now I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. Wow, that was such an engaging presentation. It brought me back into the dissertation, but also, you know, reflected last-minute refinements and some additions, which I think really helped bring the substance of what you've accomplished into greater relief. And I was very happy to see that. I want to begin, first of all, by saying how impressed I have been, which was reflected again in your presentation today, by your deep and devoted, it's really devoted immersion into the subject of your inquiry, which is not an objective inquiry, which is, you know, which you have treated all along really as subjects, as a subject of inquiry, and cultivated a relationship of really devotion, of respect and devotion. And it's quite remarkable. And in many ways, I see this as one of the great gifts and accomplishments of your research is that you have succeeded in enacting and demonstrating a kind of scholarship as devotion, and that is founded upon what Buber or Thomas Berry would describe as an I-thou relationship, or the affirmation of a cosmology as a communion of subjects rather than a collection of objects. So just in terms of the spirit of your inquiry, I think that in itself, if you had done nothing else, I think that's a remarkable achievement, and I want to praise you for that. Now, as you know from the beginning, so here's a couple of questions. I want to engage you a little bit. As you know from the beginning, I've had both fascination with and some difficulties with the title, Divining Ecology. Right. I mean, it's a catchy title. I love it. And it invites me in with all kinds of questions, and occasionally I ask myself, but what does it really mean? Like, what does divining ecology mean? So I came up with, you tell me whether you agree with this. So I have two alternatives, and I want you to tell me which one is it most like, and why and how, sort of thing. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so this is good.
is divining ecology a kind of suggesting what we might describe as eco-sustainability through divination, or looking at divination as a way of promoting eco-sustainability? So is that what divining ecology means? Or you could say, is what you're doing an example of ecologizing divination? So taking divination and demonstrating its embeddedness in an ecological context, which would be both the relationship, let's say, to the other than human world, as well as, yes, so this is what I don't know if you see where I'm getting at. So is the focus more on ecologizing divination, so showing how we need to bring in the ecological dimension explicitly and as a ground to understand the divination process? Or are you suggesting that the divination, in this case, is a form of enacting eco-sustainability, which seems to be more what you're saying? Anyway, does that make sense?
It does. Okay. And I would say it is both of those, and it is a third.
Oh, okay. Tell me.
I think, so if we think back in terms of the sense of religious ecology, I think that what this is a statement to the making divine of ecology. It's a way of taking ecology out of a strictly scientific mode of being, which is, counting salmon in a river, and adding to it a divinatory component. What does it mean that there's this many salmon in a river? Not just from a kind of quantifiable human experience. It means we're not eating salmon next year, right? Like, it means, what does it mean on a spiritual level? What does it mean within the context of the natural environment of that particular river where the salmon live? And so it's all three of those things. And again, this is like the tip of a wonderful iceberg that I hope, I mean, as you know, I really hoped to do this with multiple cultures. I mean, this was a very big, gigantic vision to begin with. And so I think that there is absolutely ways in which the first, we're looking at divination systems in relationship to eco-sustainability practices across the world. That is absolutely one path that can be taken. And then the other path of looking at divination, or looking at ecology in terms of like how it can be contained within divination systems specifically, and learning about the ecos of the sort of ecos is fine, of a particular culture through their divination system. But again, for me, and I think why I held so fast to the title, aside from it being catchy, was that it really did kind of speak to this way of making the act of caring about the earth something spiritual, something divine, something more than just counting fish.
Okay, great. So that to me then points more in the direction, as you know, in the new field of integral ecologies, which is related to the field of religion and ecology, and to religious ecologies, which is something that the field of religion and ecology studies. But many integral ecologies, such as Pope Francis's version Laudato Si, for instance, recognize a sacred dimension to nature or the cosmos, the other than human world. So it seems from what you just said, the stress is on highlighting the sacred or the enchanted dimension of, you could say, the ecological relationship. And yet, in your presentation, you seem to stress, at least at the beginning, and maybe this is more a reflection of where you first started in your research, you stressed more, and you used the word a couple of times, sustainability. And so sustainability, generally speaking, does not have this integral ecological connotation, but it usually has to do more with maintaining equilibrium between, biological systems, within an ecosystem. That's generally how sustainability is used. So, so I just point out this, I don't know if it's a tension, but something that might need, I don't know, either in the dissertation or as you proceed, something to think through the relationship between sustainability and what seems to be the greater charge and lure of your work in the direction of enchantment, of I-thou relationship, and so on. But let's stick with sustainability just for a second here. If you are going to retain sustainability as a keyword and concept that defines the ecological part of divining ecology, what evidence do you have that the relationship to the drum, in fact, in its original context, promoted sustainability? I mean, other than that it was used for protection of reindeer. I mean, what evidence can you point to that the use of the drum and shamanic divination in that particular context did in fact, or could in fact, promote sustainability?
Right. Well, there's a number of different things that I can say to kind of flesh that out. I cannot provide evidence of what the 17th century practices of an individual shaman did to incorporate sustainability into his daily shamanism. I can say that reindeer herding, which is what Paulson was, is essentially an inherently sustainable practice. And, sort of by virtue of the expansive territories which reindeers herd and protecting of them, you end up protecting large swaths of land, which add to an overall health in an ecosystem. So there is that side, but I can't provide evidence that Anders Paulson was more sustainable than the average person because he drummed. We're way past that now. So really the only way that I could do that was to look today at kind of the historical legacy and the current practices and current shamanic, current practitioners' beliefs about sustainability and how it relates to the drum. And so the way that I've understood it to relate to the drum is that the drum is a kind of record keeper of traditional ecological knowledge, basically. And I describe that in chapter 3 of the dissertation, where I go through all the ecological symbolism, talk about the sacrifice stones, which may reveal bits of historical information that has something to do with climate changes, in which case we kind of understand a bit about how sustainability was embedded into those sort of belief systems. But I think that ultimately what it comes down to is that the drum is a record keeper and a symbol for a worldview, a cosmology that is inherently sustainable. And the reasons for that are partly because everything is interconnected. The drum sort of is as a symbol on which everything exists, kind of acts as a reflection of that interconnected nature of reality. It can all be placed right there. And so you can see everything. You can see the great sort of deities of the heavens. You can see the underworld spirits. You can see, in some contemporary cases, very modern images like a car or something. And so there's a way in which the drum itself contains all, and because of the fact that it's all contained, it is also interconnected through the vehicle of the drum. The contemporary shamans that I've asked, one of them stated that the drum itself, being a circle, is reflective of a kind of circular, the sort of circular actions of sustainability. So if you were thinking about what's coming around and what's coming next, seasonal cycles, then there's an awareness of sustainability just baked into, really bad metaphor, just sort of embedded into the circular sort of style of the drum. Additionally, the drum itself is kind of created it's through practices that are sustainable. And so there's knowledge embedded, and this is information that I am not at liberty, nor as a non-Indigenous person from the Sámi tradition would share and have access to. But there's very, very deep and clear rules and regulations for how a drum is made, and it's harvested in accordance with practices that ultimately enhance and maintain sustainability. So there's also that side of it, in that traditional knowledge is being carried down through the sort of the practices of building, the handicraft. And Francis Joy's dissertation speaks a lot to that. It's called Duoji in Sámi tradition, is a huge container of traditional ecological wisdom, which helps build sustainability. And so all of that, I think, kind of goes into the ways in which the drum itself does, in fact, again, through a kind of more embodied and embedded, less logical, rational ABC way, sort of promote sustainability.
That is a really good response, Laura.
Thank you.
I would, if I may. No, not however. No, if I may though, then I all along say, wow, that's really good. Where did you say that anywhere explicitly, so succinctly in the dissertation anywhere?
I did not point to it in a way that was as wonderful, and I think that this, as clearly stated, I think I mention it in part of a sentence.
Yeah, you may want to add that, because it was very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And you really put it together. And I won't say a but or a however. And it occurred to me right at the end that, wow, what you've done also is really described how Grimm and Tucker might put it, how the drum embodies a religious cosmology. And you could argue that insofar as religious cosmologies and traditional ecological knowledge tend to embody sustainable practices relative to the other than human environment, we can assume that the drum in the practice of divination is in the service of sustainability. But it's an indirect connection via religious cosmology, as far as I can see. So you might want to think about that and link it to your use of religious cosmologies that way. But thank you.
Great.
That was a great response.
Thank you for getting that out of me.
It was good. It was impressive. Good response. Back to you, Jake.
Yeah, I'd like to. Let me build on that for a second, because that's very close to the question I had teed up, which throughout the dissertation, but especially towards the end, you work very hard to get readers and scholars to cease thinking about divination in terms of predictive or clairvoyant outcome success, right? And I think, in a sense, you take the drum this way, but in another sense, I think you take divination as a whole to be a kind of synecdoche for an entire way of life, a kind of an instantiation of it. Like, by speaking about divination, I think you're often speaking about a whole way of life, and it's a whole way of life that is bound up with traditional ecological knowledge. As far as, am I getting that part of the sort of argument of the work right?
Yes.
And so the question I had, which is I think similar to Sean's, is to Sean's concluding point there, is to what extent then is divination inherently ecological, or is the practice of, or is it rather that divination is an indicator of an ecological way of life, that it's sort of, that this kind of lived divinatory practice and this kind of rich integration of a divinatory practice within a culture, right? Where we have divinatory practices in our culture, but they're oftentimes marginalized or trivialized or whatever, right? But this sort of rich integration of a divinatory practice within a culture like this seems to be an indication for you of the of the ecological of a greater relationship to ecological flourishing on the part of the culture. So what I'm trying to get at is which direction does the sort of causal arrow go? Is it that if you have a culture that's deeply rooted in these kind of ecological relationships, and not just ecological relationships like counting salmon, but a sort of integral ecological relationship that involves awareness of a whole set of subtle relations to landscape, climate, other creatures, etc. Does that, in your understanding of it, does that tend to create the conditions under which divination can flourish? Or is it that practices of divination themselves drive that sort of ecological flourishing? Do you see what I'm asking? Yeah, okay.
I think so I'm going to go with both and again, but I have to qualify that and say that the first part, in which divination specifically, like the physicality of the practice in regards to ecology, is sustainable. I want to qualify that and say, we don't know. I want to know more of that. And that was originally what the idea of my dissertation was to be able to explore that broadly. Instead, what I hope is that I've laid out a theoretical foundation that offers that as possibly real, so that other people will also research. I mean, that's kind of the barrier of where I can, what I've done with this particular research project. For me, you know, coming from the Western astrological tradition, I've studied the history of magic for decades now. And I have often wondered, you know, you read these like medieval grimoires and they talk about like weird like newt parts, right? And like random eyes and like grabbing a hair of something. And you wonder like, where were they getting these materials? And so I think that there is a way that these practices, whether they be magical practices, whether they be divination, that there is a case to be said, or a case to be made that there was a sustainability practice, whether it was in maintaining stock of, or, you know, like cleaning the pathway from dead creatures that you could then harvest organs from, that you would then save to use in your magical practices. So there's, you know, that's one possibility, but these are the things that I have not yet done with my research. And so we currently don't know the extent to which the actual physicality of divination or of magic contributes to sustainability practices. The article by Stuart Harrop that I quote in my dissertation is one of the few works that I could find that goes to the effort of making direct connections between the physicality of divination and the physicality of sustainability and ecology. And he is, you know, mentions that in some cases it was not sustainable. In some cases, you know, using there was a sort of ancient Chinese practice of divining with turtles. And in that case, the diviners sort of went rampant and almost made extinct a species of turtle. And so even if we were to go in that direction, we would never come to say, yes, of course, all the time this is the case. But I do think that there is promising research to be done in the area that looks at the physicality of it. So that's my response to that part. I feel like I've now forgotten the second part. Oh, now in terms of the sort of the relationship between divination specifically, and how it is kind of what you called, I think, indirectly related to sustainability through a kind of cosmology or a worldview that sets up a culture for more ecologically sensitive approaches to livelihood. The thing that makes divination an especially unique connection point is that divination happens all the time. It's not a specialized practice. It's not something that can only be done by a shaman on the second full moon of the 4th year. It's happening all the time. And so I think the fact that divination is daily and a practice that's always happening in regards to the most mundane aspects of human life, and embeds the richness of the cosmology that is ecologically inclined, that's what makes divination especially sort of more intrinsically sustainable or maintaining of a sustainable worldview than other practices might be. It's that the mundanity of it. I mean, the things that people ask diviners, right? It's like, where'd my cat go? Or like, is this guy that I had a date with gonna call me? I mean, it's so human and so simple in that way. And I think that when you can take these really tiny human experiences and infuse them with so much grandeur, so much cosmological wisdom, and essentially, in particular context, sustainable sort of philosophy, then you end up creating an individual and a culture and a community that is more disposed towards those habits in an almost unconscious way.
That's interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. While you were talking, it made me think that you could also, I think, make the argument that that the sorts of cognition and the sorts of awareness and knowing that are involved in a divinatory practice are they're not sufficient to create ecological flourishing, but they might be necessary in order to have a richer relationship to the more than human world that we share, with whom we share our lives, so that the kind of calculative and instrumental approaches to knowledge that have especially been vouchsafed by the Academy for so long also tend to lead us in, again, not necessarily, but they do tend to skew us often towards an instrumentalizing relationship to the rest of the world. And so the kind of cognition that you're seeking to make a space for and seeking to make understandable is an important condition for realizing those richer relationships with the land and the earth and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. I like that reframing, that it might be necessary. I think that that's a good way to express what I'm feeling and thinking in here. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah.
Sean or Francis, do either of you have more questions you'd like to ask Laura?
Yeah, I could try and elaborate a little bit on this discussion concerning sustainability. I think one of the things that came to mind reading the dissertation in terms of the whole essence is about relationships, and the way that Anders Paulsen, let's say as an example, used his drum as a way of sustaining those relationships with the spirit world, as a way of sustaining those relationships with, maybe ancestors or reindeer, working with the reindeer, etc. And one of the things that I kind of thought was would have been beneficial would have been a kind of, I don't say a graph, but some sort of framework where you could step by step describe how these processes take place, rather than just using words, so that it's like an A4 page that starts at the bottom, goes to the top, or vice versa, and how that cycle works. Because the cyclical worldview and ultimately Anders Paulsen's work and his survival was wholly dependent on sustaining those relationships with those powers. And you know, as we know that the shaman, the Noid, his visionary and spiritual abilities have then filtered down into the wider society, and how that's been, you know, sometimes in some cases a matter of life and death, or, you know, survival continuity. So I think one of the things that I wanted to say was that, to add to that, the cyclical nature of the drum, or the oval shape of the drum, in somehow is representative of that cyclical worldview, no beginning, no end, and where sustainability and relationships fit into that. But I think the spiritual aspect is really fundamental in somehow, you know, trying to emphasize that. Any comments, Laura?
Well, so I think what's interesting is that, and I think that this takes us somewhat peripheral to the drum itself, and a little bit more into the territory of shamanism, of the Noidi Vota. And I think that what's very interesting about the practice of a shaman or Noidi is the ability to travel between worlds. And so they are also cyclical, right? Like that's kind of the practice of a Noidi, is to go somewhere, return with new information, to go somewhere and engage with a particular deity, and to come back. And so there is a way in which the practices of the Noidi are, and obviously in many traditions, in the Sámi included, the drum is the tool that they use to enter into those trance states, which allows them to be that cyclical person. And so there's a way in which all of these kind of cycles are happening on multiple layers. It's, you know, embedded in the cyclical sort of style of the drum. In certain cases, you know, God, I want to show you all real quick. Let me just do this. In, you know, Anders Paulsson's drum is unique, but some of the other drums may be better to explain some of these concepts. And I'm going to show you all again the one of the drums of the southern type, and you can kind of see even more so in these the cyclical nature of the Noidi Vota tradition of Sámi symbolism. And it really kind of starts in the center and sort of spirals outward with the different kind of rings of where the images lie. There's, you know, images that are attached to the outside ring, and then there's some that are kind of in the middle. And so there's a spiral cyclical nature embedded into the actual imagery of the drum. Anders Paulsson's drum is a little different. It's more the just the shape itself and reflective of cosmological layers. But so I think that there's some way in which it's just consistent cycling and spiraling. So you have the drum, which spirals in symbols, that allows the Noidi to go into a trance and come in and out in sort of a cyclical relationship. And his experience of the multiple layers then can translate to the community, and then the community can translate that into sustainability practices that think about seasons, that think about, I would like to cut down this tree, but if I wait one more year, it will be past its prime, and then these other trees that are next to it can grow further. So it's a matter of consistently thinking about what's coming next, what's coming from behind, and having that circular cyclical experience, which is embedded both in the drum and I think in the practices of the shaman himself or herself. And you have frozen for a moment, Francis, just so you know. Or for longer than a moment. Okay, did you hear all of that, Francis? You seem to have returned. Zoom.
Well, maybe while Francis is paused there, Sean, did you have other questions you'd like to?
Nothing
ask Laura?
substantial, but maybe just this one thing. I'm curious what you would say to this, Laura. Gee, it's too bad. I wonder if Francis can hear us. Well, here's one. Okay.
I'm sure it looks like he went away and will probably come back.
He'll
so
probably come back.
We can
Okay.
repeat.
All right. in reading your dissertation, along with the more general sort of I-thou relationship that you have with you know, the field, your subject matter, the Sámi people, there is a particular I-thou relationship with Paulson, obviously, and you know, one senses a kind of almost like a karmic tuning into the life and the soul, this particular soul, and you know, the trying to picture what happened on that fateful day, and actually even afterwards, what happened with this tragic murder by Gunderson. Now, what I'm curious about Gunderson, so Paulson met his fate at the hands of Gunderson, apparently, who it surprises me that he seems to be characterized as, you know, an insane person because he went around naked and so on. Well,
In the
why
snow.
wasn't he considered? Yeah, why wasn't he considered to be possessed? You know, why is he characterized in sort of modern psychopathological terms as the murderer of Paulson, whereas Paulson is characterized in non sort of medical terms as somebody consorting with the devil? This is surprising to me, and I wonder if that's inaccurate. Is that actually how? Is that how the contemporary documents describe Gunderson, or is this a later?
No, in the court documents from the trial, that is how Gunderson is recorded, and so it's, you know, because basically the court records read like, and then Paulson says this, and then the jury asked him this, and then when it's the Gunderson moment, it's like it opens. It's kind of amazing. It's a little close, but I can't quite grab it right now, so I'm going to paraphrase best I can. But it opens with, on February 22nd, the, you know, court was rearranged to discuss the matter no longer of Anders Paulson's life, but his murder. And then they go through and kind of give this narrative of what's happening in the courtroom. And they say things like Gunderson was a mad person, and he, you know, is known by all in the community to be, you know, not right in the head, essentially. And I think that there's a couple of different things going on. I think first and foremost, the charge of witchcraft was huge. And so I think that the church, to give them the more credit than should be due in this context, they were under pressure, right, to kind of deliver a proper judgment based on what were really grievance offenses. And so if they had turned their attention to Gunderson rather than staying full force on this trial of witchcraft, they wouldn't have been doing, you know, what was considered, I think at the time, the right thing to do, which is persecute witches. I mean, we were, you know, definitely in the witchcraft trials that were all over both Europe and the New World, a little later than some of the ones that were happening in the New World. But I think that this really speaks to the intensity of the accusation of being a witch or of witchcraft. And there is a deep sadness in that. And, you know, I think I started off with that quote from Liv Helene Williamson, who says, you know, he wasn't charged with, the only thing that they charged him with was having a drum or playing the drum. He hadn't murdered anybody. He hadn't, you know, caused any natural disasters. He hadn't even been at witches' meetings. Like he hadn't consorted with the devil. Like they couldn't even find any of that. And yet still, because of the drum, he was considered a witch and he had to be burned at the stake. And so I think to focus on Gunderson as a figure that was anything but, you know, just a happenstance sort of negative influence or mentally, you know, mentally charged sort of person, then I think that it would have taken away from the impetus of the real issue, which is there can be no more witches in the North, essentially. Interesting note, which I do say in the dissertation, is that Paulson was the last Noaidi to be sentenced to death, or to be, you know, tried for witchcraft. And so there's a way in which this was ending at this time, but he still, in the court records we hear, was supposed to be made I can't remember what I said, you know, he was made an example of. So I think it really just speaks to the intensity of what was happening in the witchcraft trials. I know that Finnmark, the county, so this is a county in northern Norway, northeastern Norway. It's like one of the biggest counties, but the most sparsely inhabited. It's largely tundra. They had one of the highest percentages of witchcraft accusations and burnings in all of Europe, based on sort of the per capita population. And so it was sort of a lot of pressure, I think, on the authorities to keep the Sámi and the pagan Norwegian witches, who were often female, not always, to keep them scared and to keep control of this. In one case in the court records, it says, you know, that it's especially grievous to practice witchcraft up there because all of these poor people have no access to doctors and they don't know any better. And so people like Paulson or other witches are taking advantage of, you know, these sort of circumstances. And so it was really just, I think that the focus was supposed to be on Paulson and Gunderson, you know, and then also there's like what I was saying of, you know, we don't really know. Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe he did it. Maybe he did it on purpose, or maybe there was intention. Like, you know, we have court records that give a very clear picture of what the court records want us to see. But that's all conjecture and fantasy at this point. So I can't really say much more about it. So I hope that enriches or brings about some kind of answer to your question.
Yeah, no, it's just curious, and I have others, but I don't want to monopolize.
Did Francis make it back online?
It doesn't look like it.
Oh,
No, I think he's here.
Oh, are you?
Okay.
Good. I couldn't see you there.
Oh yeah, I see. Okay. Francis, did you have a follow-up to what I had said? Because we lost your connection at that point.
I didn't catch all of it, Laura. Obviously, I disappeared out the group 3 or 4 times, but you know, one of the things that really came to mind was this outline of the.
We're really far away from Finland, I guess.
Oh dear. I was looking forward to hearing that.
Can you repeat it, Francis?
Shall I try again?
Yeah, what you might want to try is turn off your video, and you might have a better connection just with audio.
Off. Okay.
I could do it for you if you'd like, or.
Okay. Yeah, if you would try that, give that a try, Jacob.
Yeah, the sound is good now.
Okay.
Why isn't that turning off?
Yeah.
There we go.
Is that better?
We'll see. Hopefully.
We can hear you.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Good. Yeah. The thing that came to mind was that you know, that when the outline of the drum was enforced, a whole load of sustainable practices kind of went with it also. A whole load of practices related to sustainability and those relationships with the spirits, this interdependency, this holistic kind of way of seeing the world, microcosm, macrocosm relationship, the drum embodying those powers, embodying those spirits, embodying those sacrificial places. Those work with those satyrs that say, as we know, the sacrifices were also part of that sustainability of maintaining those relationships. And in many ways, I was thinking about how the term is being reintroduced today because of the climate change, etc. But looking back on what you've written there and also what's been discussed this evening brings to mind how that concept was sort of banished, if that's the right word to use, 350 years ago. I don't know if anybody's mentioned that or you've considered that in what you're writing, but when you do take into consideration just the function of the drum and the many strands that come from there that are to do with those relationships, how the outline of those spiritual practices really impacted sustainability, and whether or not that has any bearing on where we are today in the world in terms of climate change, is definitely something worth thinking about.
Yeah, that is not the way that you phrased that these ideas were also banished at the time, is not a connection I had made in exactly that way. And I thank you for kind of expressing it in that way, because it is in so many ways very ultimately true. And I think that, what I have noticed, and what I do discuss in my dissertation in chapter 1, the chapter on shamanism, is how the shamanic tradition also seems to be connected to the sort of political ecological activism of the Sámi people. And you can kind of see sort of concurrently within the last century, a sort of uprising of Sámi culture, of a reclaiming of Sámi shamanic practices, both of a kind of traditional family ancestral nature, but also of a kind of neo-shamanic, sort of modern contemporary neo-pagan style, and that kind of really started to bubble up alongside, and in some ways as a response to, and part of, some major ecological crises that were happening. I'm thinking obviously namely of the Alta conflict, and shaman, two Sámi shamans, Nilas Sombi and Eric Mirhag, were both involved in the kind of the sort of standing up to the Norwegians who were trying to build a dam in sacred Sámi territory. And so there's a way that if we reflect backwards from that fact, we can see absolutely there was a loss of that worldview with the loss of the drums. And now, as that is sort of coming back together, coming back into light, and as more Sámi people are recognizing their inherent right to steward their land in a way that has been going well for a very long time in a pretty harsh environment as well, then we're also seeing that this is actually a kind of spiritual mission for them based in this pre-Christian tradition, and obviously symbolized in the Sámi drum. And I also want to just sort of ask to you all, and just to kind of ponder, we think of sustainability from the perspective of an inherently non-sustainable culture currently. And so you got to kind of wonder too, like, they didn't necessarily outline their world as sustainable because it just inherently was. And there wasn't these sort of questions of what do we do to make, they just lived it. And so there wasn't a lot of conflict in that way. So, I mean, I don't know that that's the case, but you can't help but wonder if that was an important part of it, is that it was the way it was, and there wasn't a need to comment on it. It was just a sort of common behavior of people who live in a sort of, what we were saying, sort of, cosmology, a religious cosmology, essentially. So I think that's kind of my response to that.
Yes, thank you, Laura. And if I could just finish with this one, Jacob, if that's okay, if we have time to do that. One of the things that I wanted to say that also I didn't say just previously, but I will say now, is that you've written about Michael Harner in your dissertation and his work, and quite often when Harner is referenced, when he's mentioned, it's very much about these conflicting views with contemporary shamanism, etc. But for me, understanding the broader sense of Harner's work, I think Harner's work was actually about reintroducing those sustainable practices back into the world, and he's never acknowledged for that, really, because of the conflict that surrounds appropriating other people's traditions, ayahuasca, etc., etc. But I think, looking aside from that, these shamans who were active in the 60s and 70s, before this kind of uprising here in the north, even maybe perhaps, I think that the work that they were doing, whether consciously or unconsciously, certainly is connected with revival of this sustainable need for living before the real acceleration of climate change happened. That they, this contemporary, or what they call the core shamanism, is very much based on reintroducing those practices that were forbidden, that are ultimately connected to sustainability and much broader relationships.
Yeah, that is a really good point, and something I'm absolutely, yes, I think that a little bit more can be said about Harner. And I think this kind of goes back to Jake's first question about the comparative practice, and whether or not it's an act of building bridges and of seeing individuality and complementary sort of experiences between individuals, or whether it's an experience of totally negating individuality. Just to kind of, to give a bit of example, in my dissertation, I write about Eliade and for those of you who don't know, Eliade's book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, is like this thick, okay? And there's a sentence in there where he says, I don't find it necessary to go into the details of divination. It's all basically the same across all these cultures. And it's just like not even true. I mean, it's just such a narrow-minded experience and perspective. And so that would be an example of how not to, do comparative analyses. And I think that Harner, I think that one of the challenges with Harner is the profitability of what he has done. He's not just given freely his research. And so there's been this kind of professionalism that's taken place, and a building of a financially generating business off of the material. So I think that's especially where the challenges come in. But I do think that the work that he did, the research that he did, the connections that he built were ultimately very beneficial. And really make it so that, someone like me could, without appropriating, sort of start to explore. If you read The Way of the Shaman, it's very neutral in tone. It's not especially, specific to one culture or another. And so I could, go internally and do a meditation that's shamanic in nature without appropriating one particular culture's practices. And so I think it's very important work, especially as we see the consequences of a world in which that kind of worldview, sustainability, holism, eco-religious cosmologies, without those, this is sort of where we're at. And so I do think that Harner's work was important in that way. And thank you for clarifying that as such. I think that's my full response there.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you.
I think we're just about ready to for the three of us to retire to our breakout room, and then y'all can have some more discussion while we talk amongst ourselves. I think that's a great place to end it, Laura, with reflecting on returning back to the issue of a proper comparison, or a respectful comparison. I think when you were talking, it made me think about how whenever we do comparative work, it's not just two terms, it's a triadic relationship. It's comparing the subject that we might be thinking about with another subject, right? Two different divinatory practices, two different religious groups. But the triadic aspect is that the scholar is involved in it. And it's when that's hidden that it can become so oppressive. And you've brought yourself reflexively into your work, not hidden yourself in the midst of that comparison, and I think made yourself porous to the people that you're also, to the traditions that you're also comparing, which is a more vulnerable stance for a scholar to have, but one that invites conversation and dialogue, and I hope respect. Certainly, that's what I've seen today. So,
thank you.
I'm going to suck Francis and Sean and myself out into some other virtual space, and we will eventually return. I hope you guys have a great conversation while we're gone.
Thank you.
Let me try this. I have not been sucked out. Let's see. I'm gonna turn off my.
Does someone need to suck you? Oh, there we go. We lost him. Okay. Okay, I am really glad that they're gone for a moment. And before I open it up to questions, I want to pull a card from this deck called Sarakas Viverscourt, and it is a deck of oracle cards that are based off of Sámi deities and symbols. It was made by Astrid Ingebjorg Swart. It's really wonderful, and I just want to invite some other energy into this sort of field besides the mental, rational that we've been dealing with. So I'm just going to kind of, look at how beautiful they are. I'm just going to kind of shuffle briefly. I'll pick a card, I'll read it to you, and then we don't need to talk about it. I just want to invite some of the more than human world into this without the watching eyes of my dissertation committee. Okay, so, oh, that's such a great card to have pulled. I feel really grateful. So this is Beaivi. It's the Sámi symbol for the sun. Let me read you just for a moment from it, and this gives you all a chance to think about questions you might have for me. Oh, I'm so glad I got the sun. That makes me feel good, just so you know. So the sun, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's actually kind of long. She provides this little book with commentary. But it's characterized the sun as life-giving power, perfection, and abundance. And a kind of sentence about it is the manifestation of the full and creative life force, the lighting of your and our world. So we'll just kind of think about Beaivi as with us through all of this. Okay, we are open for questions. Ashton, do you field these, or should I open up the chat, or how does this work? I think we have to, what was that?
What were you gonna say?
Can you kind of keep an eye on people who are,
Yeah.
Okay, good.
And everybody, you probably know this, but you can unmute yourself if you have a question.
So the floor is all of yours now. Thank you.
Alexis, go ahead.
Hi, Laura, that was, congratulations. You did a beautiful job. I'm curious, and Sean started asking about it, but I was curious about the relationship through your research that you came to with Paulson in terms of more of like a karmic relationship, or if there was dialogue, if there was dreams. Like, I'm imagining, just as you presented so beautifully, I could just sense a kinship with this man that you could know in other ways, and I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah, of course. I was really cautious, to the extent that I avoided writing about him up until I was like deep into my dissertation, because I didn't really, and normally I would not be the type of person to say, yes, there's a karmic connection between me and this person. But the vehemence with which I avoided it for so long does make me kind of think, well, maybe there's something there. But I really was trying not to focus on this particular individual because it felt too intimate. It was scary for me. I didn't feel necessarily like the right person to engage with this material. But ultimately, because it has the court records and the sort of artifact of the drum, it presented really the best case, and I had to just stop avoiding it and kind of admit, okay, I'm writing about this man, I'm writing about this man's drum, and so that means I have to develop a relationship here. And I wouldn't necessarily say that there was any of the kind of multi-layered subliminal realm sort of shamanic or psychic connections, but I also very intentionally have not participated in that. As much as I'm a diviner, I have not sought out that type of experience, particularly within the context of this dissertation, because I needed to just write the dissertation. And I'm a participant, but I didn't want to get lost in territory that I don't know. And so I didn't do that, but I did spend a lot of time in Sápmi, and I did spend time in the Varangur Fjord region, which is where Paulson was not necessarily from, but where he did most of his reindeer herding. And so I went and I visited stones that were potentially the stones that he went and sacrificed or prayed at. And so in that sort of pilgrimage process, I held him very, very close at hand. And I went and visited the Stylenset Memorial, which is in Vardo, which is a small island a ways from where the courthouse was that Paulson Paulson's trial took place in. And that is a kind of 20th century, it was made like 10 years ago, art exhibit that's a memorial to all of the people who were murdered as a result of those witchcraft trials and burnings in Finnmark in the 17th century. And so I did kind of go and, as best I could, sort of pay respects, right, to this man's, the closest thing we could have to like a gravestone or something. And so there were ways in which I've very cautiously and intentionally did try and engage a relationship with this human who once lived and who I've learned so much from. So yeah, that it was definitely part of it, but in a much more reserved way. Thanks. Anyone else? Yeah, it looks like Matt and Becca have their hand up, and then Jessica, I would love to hear from you after that.
Laura, that was really just such a beautiful presentation of your work, and
Thank you.
really moving too. I have so many different questions I would want to ask, but the one that's coming to mind right now is knowing that in one of the earlier conceptions of your dissertation, you were going to focus on 4 drums. And of course, the parameters of a doctoral dissertation have to be narrowed down. And I just wonder if, I was glad to see that you brought in another one of those drums in answer to some of the questions that you were fielding. But if there's anything else that you might want to say about those other 3 drums or one of those drums that feels relevant to the conversation here in the defense, that, and maybe that's a way of pointing toward further research that you're wanting to do with those drums, or, even a deeper layer in terms of a multicultural study. So I would just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, okay, so I've already been out in the clear with everybody here. I'm an astrologer, right? I study astrology academically. I've done that throughout college, but I'm also a practitioner of astrology. And there's one Swedish theorist who has looked at the Sámi drums and believes and kind of gives pretty good evidence for the possibility that they are represented, that the symbols and the way the symbols are aligned are representative of constellations. This is not to say that they're astrological. They could be, but that's not what I'm saying. But I have been dying to dive into that research, and I haven't been able to because it doesn't fall under the purview of Anders Paulson's drum. And so it was really hard to kind of not focus on that. But now that I'm done, I'm really looking forward to exploring Bo Sommerström's research, wherein he looks at actually what constellations are visible in above the Arctic Circle in various times of the year, and how might that have been used in terms of the various journeys, physical or in the subliminal or in the sort of in between realms that the shaman would travel through. And so I think for me, that's like the first step is, and I've already done preliminary research because, like you mentioned, I was planning on writing about one drum that I thought best kind of exhibited some of those characteristics that Sommerström discusses. And so I'm absolutely going to turn my attention and look at some of those as well. And I think that'll be the first place that it starts, is to really try and figure out how the stars themselves were built into this cosmology and the role that they played. Thanks. Jessica, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for coming.
Hi, congratulations.
Thank you.
Really, I'm really impressed with your research. And so I am a candidate over in transformative studies, for those of you who don't know me. And I am also the vice president of Pacific Sámi Society here in Seattle. And so we are, many of us have Sámi heritage that was hidden from us, or maybe is veiled or lesser known. And so we are seeking to heal our own ruptures and our own lineages through our work together and to learn together. And I'm curious if you have encountered Lestadianism. And so some of us who, I'm 3rd generation Tornedalian, Finnish, and Inari Sámi, and Lestadianism is something that I inherited through my American Sámi and Finnish family. And it's interesting to seek out the what survives from the Sámi drum and the cosmology and the culture through Lestadianism. And I'm just curious if you've encountered any of this, or if it's intrigued you, or if you've had any, if you've done any work around this.
To a certain extent, I have. I mean, you can't do real scholarship in Sami culture without at least running into it. And especially in terms of the shamanic tradition and sort of cosmology, symbols, deities. Lestadius's work, Fragments of Lappish Mythology, has been absolutely invaluable in coming to know the kind of deities and the symbols and the world of the Sami people. His work, his source work about the Sami people that was written prior to the kind of religious awakening that resulted in Lestadianism, has been a very important text in my work. But again, because that happened kind of before he really stepped into this spiritual leadership role, I am not familiar with the kind of the Lestadianism as it has been passed down through the ages. I've read articles about it. I understand a bit of the kind of the sort of liveliness that Lestadianism embodied, which would have been very different from the kind of stark Protestantism of Norway, Sweden, Finland during the late Middle Ages Renaissance era. And so I do understand that there's such a beauty, and I think that also may be, and this is my opinion. I'm sure that there are, indigenous Sami, whether they're, living in America and have ancestry or are living in Sápmi currently. I'm sure there are some that maybe don't think fondly of it and think of it as a negative kind of appropriation. But in my view, I do think it's a beautiful way of what we were talking about in that kind of comparative, in a way that brings out good things of a culture and good sort of traditions, rather than sort of completely losing it and losing identity. And so as someone who's not Sámi, as someone who doesn't have any kind of ancestry or family that I can kind of talk to about these things, I don't really understand how they layer together, but that's just my opinion from the outside. So I would love to hear even more of what you say, especially in regards to this sort of research or how it relates to ecology, but no pressure if you don't have anything prepared.
No, it's been a journey for me. So, I was always told that we were Finnish. And when I began to do my research, I noticed that our name was actually Swedish, and had to trace it back, and had this ambivalence around my surname, which is in Tornedal, it's spelled W-I-I-P-P-A. It's pronounced Vipa. And the deeper name is Kairos Vuopio. And so I traced the surname to this specific place that means the curve and the flow of the Tornio River there. Yeah. And then I found deeper layers in Sápmi, and I'm connected to the Heta family through this lineage. And that's really where, as far as I've been able to go, is to find it's very difficult to trace Sámi heritage in many cases, but I've been able to locate a Sámi grandmother there. So, and so I was born into an area of Minnesota that's known as the Finnish Triangle. So I have a lot of these imprints. And I always thought of them as just old Finnish, which is what my great-grandfather said we were. We're old Finnish, not just Finnish, but we're the old Finns. And, he was old, so I wasn't exactly always sure what that meant, but I did have a sense that it meant something other than age, that, there was more to the story. So really, a part of my work with Pacific Saamisjärvi is building a relationship and finding these connections, and it's been very nourishing for me. And I love that you say that there is no one way to be Sámi, because as a Sámi American, I have other lineages as well that live in me, and I'm 100% all of them, all of the time. And that is how I choose to be Sámi, in addition to how I choose to be, Irish. So that's what I have to offer, is that, I am continuously trying to walk the reflexive space of my own identity in taking care and being cautious around universalizing similar themes within each of my ancestral lineages, and also focusing on specificity. But I love how we are in this dissertation discussion connecting the traditional ecological knowledges, and even giving credit to like Michael Harner for bringing consciousness to the aspects of shamanism that we need. And so I don't have any answers, but these are questions, and these are hopefully contributions to the discussion. So.
Thank you so much for coming and attending, and for seeing the flyer and deciding that you had to be here. So it's very good. Are there any other questions? I hope they're not gone too long, but it's okay if they are. Matt, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Laura,
You're welcome.
for your exemplary defense and what appears to be a magical dissertation that I look forward to looking at when it's all technically edited and published. I had a question that came up after you said something at the beginning of your presentation about the Sámi as something. You said something like they're the last remaining indigenous culture in Europe or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it got me thinking about the definition of indigeneity and whether that's geographical and historical, like has to do with the people that have a kind of temporal priority in a specific place. But then there's also more of a typological way of like distinguishing between modern disenchanted people cut off from place and tradition that may distinguish, indigenous from not. And I just wonder how you think about that. Is it just a matter of temporal priority in a place, like these people were here first? I mean, I guess in some indigenous myths, maybe there's an idea that the people literally came out of the land and like didn't arrive there from somewhere else, but are of the place. And then there's a more anthropological Western scientific point of view that like all of human beings migrated from out of Africa at some point and populated the planet. So like, how do you think about what it means to be indigenous, given all these different complexities?
As a not indigenous person, I can only give a very, I think, cursory answer. And I think for the purposes of my dissertation, for the purposes of future indigenous research, I think that continuity of relationship, where, I'm going to stick into this relationship concept, but I think that the continuity of relationship with land, with the more than human world, with the cosmology of a particular religious or spiritual tradition, and then the continuity of the relationship with the people who share in those things, I think that's really the key part of indigeneity. And what we have seen in the case of many indigenous traditions that are really kind of lost to the sands of time, also in places like Europe and definitely in the New World, we see that there are these kind of living traditions that come back that, may have had sort of deep roots, but that there's not the continuity. And the Sámi people, luckily, I think, due to the fact of the location, I mean, really, I'm fairly certain that it's simply because they lived so far away from what was happening, with the building of civilization, whatever that means, in the sort of Western Europe. They were so far away that they had more time to preserve their worldview, to preserve a continuity of knowledge, of family units, of relationships. I think this is I don't remember the number exactly, but you can look at a map and see at what point different parts of Europe were Christianized, and the Sámi were late in the game. The regions of the Arctic North, really it took a long time. And so I think that, that's, and as somebody who's traveled throughout Sápmi in the modern world where there's trains and buses and roads, it is hard to get around up there. And so thinking of doing this 1,000 years ago, really kind of brings into awareness, like, oh, they really just were safely isolated, and in this way that allowed them to have that cultural continuity. And so I think that that's the key with indigeneity, is that it's a continued relationship, rather than radically interrupted through, more often than not, right, the kind of the efforts of colonialism. So the indigenous communities that are no longer sort of connected are by no means, I like that, isolated, are by no means gone because they wanted to be, right? In most cases, they were ushered out of their lands or of their practices or of their worldviews.
Thanks, that's helpful. That continuity piece is helpful, yeah.
Any other questions? Someone has to have another question. Julie is asking, yoik. So, I mean, I definitely am not going to yoik, but the yoik is a tradition of Sámi vocalization, singing, and it is, to me, one of my favorite things to listen to. But it also has a rich sort of wonderful quality that the yoik is more than just singing about something. It kind of is singing the essence of something. It's sort of bringing into being, wherever you happen to be, the spirit of a person, place, or thing. And so parts of the natural world can have a yoik. And so not only is Sámi culture really awesome in its sort of symbology, but it has a vocal singing component that also brings this, like, you know, really sort of wonderful sound to the world. And so it's kind of like another way in which the relationship between human and the more than human world is celebrated, I think, through voice and through song. So I don't know if there was a specific question, but that's kind of what I can say about that. Oh, hi, there you are.
I should expand on that a little bit. Hi, I'm Julie.
Hi.
And friend of Jessica's, and one of the founders and the current president of the Pacific Sámi CRV here in Seattle.
Welcome.
And I so thank you for this. It was fascinating. I've learned a lot. I've studied the trial a little bit myself in my research on, and I suspect that I do have ancestry with Anders Poulsen.
Wonderful. Wow.
Right after his trial, about 3 years after his trial, a direct ancestor who was a Nuadi in Jukkasjärvi, which was the parish that Anders belonged to, and it evidently was Christianized, you might say, a little bit later than some of the others. And that's why I've understood that in Vardo, he was truly not just an outsider to the village, but also to the more strict expectations of the Christians there. So, and that was fascinating to me when I discovered that, because my Matsheif or Heva, and a few years after his trial, was born in Jukkasjärvi, and he was written up in the church records there by the priest. And this was probably 50 years later, that he was basically a rascal who didn't come to church and went about the countryside casting spells. So I'm very proud of that ancestor, I have to say. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was is about women. Did you encounter discussions of memories of, did you meet any women who are
so you know, the funny thing, the funny, challenging, sort of surreal thing about doing fieldwork, or about the fieldwork experiences I had in Sápmi, is that, right, the Sámi are divided now amongst 4 different countries, and so they speak 4 different languages. And so at first, as a young doctoral student, I was like, I'm going to learn Swedish, and then I was like, well, that won't help me, I need Norwegian, and then that won't help me, I need Finnish, and so I didn't learn any of the languages, right? But I really kind of quickly came to realize that language was going to be a barrier in my work. And so there was one female shaman who I wanted to interview at one of the at a shaman gathering that I had attended, and I could not get her and her she spoke Russian. Her translator spoke Norwegian and Russian and English. So her translator was going to translate into this. It was just this roundabout, like really kind of mind-altering experience to try and do that. But she and I never got together. However, I did witness her give lectures and presentations, and I did witness her give healings within the context of this gathering. And so there are absolutely female shamans from some of the people who I have interviewed or asked. I do know that in one case, and I write about this in my dissertation, the shaman, I don't know that he would say he inherited the tradition, but his mother was also a practitioner. And so there's a myth, and in certain of the historical sources, they say that women were not, but that doesn't seem to bear any fruit in the modern world. Whether or not that was the case in the 17th century, I don't know that we can find that out. But if we look at sort of the historical memory, the family anecdotes, there were definitely females who were shamans. And I would love, and I have made some friends with some of them. Again, I haven't done the interviews, but that's a horizon of research that I think is really important to start to engage with, because I do think that the contributions of males and females can be slightly different. And especially within the context of Sámi culture, where traditionally there were very distinct roles between what the females were doing, making, what their Duoji handicraft tradition was, compared with what the men were making, doing. And so I do think it would be really wonderful and important to look more into the specifically female parts of the shamanic tradition, because they may have different information than what is more commonly documented. So that's something that I've had a little bit of exposure to and a lot of interest in, but I haven't had a chance yet to really kind of do the due diligence and write about it.
So if I could just offer two more things, and one is that in looking for women who had shamanic power, I think that we will discover what several people have in looking for folk tales that were recorded by women. And it's because the researchers were male, obviously, and so they found and had access to other men. And I think that maybe looking at yoik is a really wonderful way to explore, because men and women yoik, and this is obviously. So I am currently reviewing all the lyrics of Mariboina, who is, the goddess of yoik. And I think in looking through these lyrics, it would really, some academic is going to do this someday. You guys, if you're out there, look through these lyrics for clues. And it's not that a lot of them are contemporary lyrics, but some of them are based on older yoiks, and some are based on poetry that have been done, written by Sámi people. So there's a lot to explore there. And she is also was raised Lestadian, as I was. And so there you find where exactly was that tradition kept alive. And I encourage you to look at documentaries about her and other, where she has talked specifically about how it is kept in the music. And the emotion of the music. So
I love that. Thank you. And especially, her song Gula Gula has really important messages for our current times right now. And so that is a very, very good pointing me in that direction. And again, I do think, it speaks so much to like the special contribution that we as women have to the world, but then also how that gets translated into these traditional sort of knowledge practices, and then maybe even traditional ecological practices. So thank you for pointing that out. Wonderful. And I can't wait to talk more about your ancestors, but maybe not in this context.
Another time.
Thank you for sharing though. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Jessica, you have another one?
I just wanted to share that, I wanted to seek relationship with other Sámi Americans, and I met Julie at the Nordic Museum, and through ancestral research, we found out we're 9th cousins in at least one lineage. So there's a lot of interconnections between us. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, wonderful.
Justin, did you have a question? Or Mary Claire?
Oh, yes. Well, I'll keep this really brief. I'm Mary Claire. I'm also over in the Transformative Studies Department where Jessica is, and finishing writing my dissertation right now. There's a million things I could say. This was an extraordinary journey of bearing witness to your journey. And I just, before everybody came back on, I wanted to say that one of the most precious moments for me was how you took the question relative to, so is by divining ecology, do you mean this or do you mean this? And you said, yes, and this. And I thought it was a beautiful embodiment and enactment of a ternary consciousness that is the participatory, shamanic and ecological and divining. And anyway, as I said, I could say a million things, but that was just something I wanted to say was super fun to witness.
Thank you. And I was so glad I had a third option. I was just felt very satisfied in being able to contribute that. So thanks for recognizing and witnessing that moment of glory. I felt that way too. So I'm glad it was seen as such.
Definitely. Thank you. This was really, really fun.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
One more.
Okay, go ahead.
So Mary Claire, I wonder if you can just share a little bit about where you are and what the painting is behind you and who made that painting.
Oh, well, I happen to be in Southern Nevada right now at the Temple of Goddess Spirituality dedicated to Sekhmet. So we're talking Egyptian. She is the Eye of Re. The details and the serendipities and the synchronicities. Jessica, you so set me up for this. Is nothing short of astonishing, given who she is, and that I would have been catapulted here as a place to, quote, shelter in place on my journey between the Association for the Study of Women in Mythology conference in Albuquerque and where I thought I was going back up to the Pacific Northwest. So to be here at this time on the planet, when we're and she's strategically located, Sekhmet, facing the Nevada test site and 3 miles from the Air Force Creech base. So to be bearing witness to the ecological devastation and degradation and to this time of death, birth, and regeneration. So so I'm with you all in spirit, and I don't know if that answers your question, setting me up like that, Jessica, but she's here to bless us all in this transition.
Well, if I may, I just want to say the painting behind Mary Claire was painted by Monica Sjoo, S-J-O-O, who is a Swedish artist, and her work is very much about reclaiming traditional ecological knowledge. If you want to Google Monica Sjoo, S-J-O-O, with the umlauts above the O's, she's an amazing artist and one of my favorites. So
awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's really beautiful. And art, Francis, my the external committee member, he recently published a book called Sámi Shamanism, and he goes in and looks at the relationship between old drums and new drums, because there are still people who are painting new drums and building them, some in a more traditional manner that look very much alike to the old ones, with a kind of simple painting of the traditional alder bark paint. And then there are some that are really exciting and really look like a kind of modern take on a sort of Sámi drum. And they're indigenous people who are kind of living out that experience. And so I think that art is such a rich topic of study, both from the historical perspective in these very simple symbols, but also in this contemporary way, because traditional ecological knowledge is sometimes best shared through things like art or symbol rather than through academic inquiry. Hi, Jake. I see you guys have returned. You're still muted.
Hi, Laura. We've returned. We've had a wonderful discussion with each other, and we are all in agreement that this is an extremely impressive piece of work. The descriptions that the richly descriptive account you've given of the Anders Poulsson's drum, of the relationship of divination to ecology, and all of these other areas is just something to feel really proud of, and it's something that we're very grateful to have been able to engage with you on. As you know, there are some revisions that the committee will want to the dissertation, and I will communicate those to you in writing. But with those revisions to some of your research description of the research methodologies and abstract and some of the footnotes and things like that, and treatment of sustainability with those things in mind. Other than that, we're very happy to approve this dissertation with those revisions. So I'll be the first to say proleptically, congratulations, Dr. Machete. It's very exciting.
Thank you.
Yay!
Yeah, cheers. Everyone's drinking tea right now, right?
I think it's after 10 where Francis is. So.
Oh, it's true. Oh yeah. Did he escape?
I think he's in here somewhere.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I look forward to having a chance to take all of the wonderful stuff that I was able to somehow find today and put it into the revisions and make it all tidy and be done with it and also begin really with it in a new way. So thank you so much.
And I've got a list that I will communicate to you. So
okay, good.
You've heard from.
Perfect.
So
I want to say thank you so much to everybody. There's sort of formal acknowledgements in the dissertation, but just like while I have everyone's attention, I just want to say thank you to to you three, most especially Jake for kind of holding this center, and for Francis and Sean who really kind of provided these boundaries to my mind that just wants to go, and you sort of kept me focused, and really it ended up being exactly what I needed, and it turned into such a lovely project because of that. So I am indebted to all of you. And I also want to thank Frederick Prost, who's one of the contemporary shamans who has been invaluable to my research. And of course, every person who I've ever met, who I've shared an encounter with in Sápmi, the foxes, the trees, every experience. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to make a connection and to build that relationship. I also want to thank my family for making sure that the house and the children didn't fall apart or get lost while I was busy roaming the Arctic as much as I was. And then, the most important one for me is I really want to thank Anders Paulsen or Paula Onda for in whatever way it happened, supporting and inviting and reminding me that this was the project I was supposed to have accomplished. And so I think that that's the most important acknowledgement for me. So Julie, your hand is up. Do you have one more question before we kind of?
I just wanted to compliment you on your necklace.
Oh yes, thank you. I bought this on my first trip and I wear it almost every day, and it's tiny, but it reminds me of what I'm doing here. So and I guess maybe we can also thank Bea Evie. I pulled an oracle card while you guys were in your breakout room. So, and I got the sun, which is a pretty good one, I think, just so you know.
Well, Laura, I do have to sign off now. So I wanted to congratulate you again for such fantastic work and really wonderful model defense.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I look forward to being in touch with you soon.
Okay.
Okay. Many blessings, Dr. Laura, proleptically said. As
Which doctor?
Which Dr. Laura? Okay, blessings.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Francis. Great meeting you.
Thanks, Sean.
You too. Anything else? Or are we all done?
You, Sean. Thank you,
Laura. Yeah, Laura.
Bye.
Yeah,
I think Francis wants to say something.
Yeah, it's coming up here to 20 to 11 in the evening, so I'm going to cut loose and go and have something to eat. But a pleasure and an honour to be part of the process, Laura. And
thank you.
Thank you also, Jacob, for your professionalism this evening. It's been really very great, and congratulations, Laura. You've done a fantastic job. What a work! And if you want to revise anything, if there's some points, Jacob, whatever he communicates to, if you want a little bit of clarity with those, there's more stuff that you need to do, then I'm still on lockdown. So yeah, I can't
Can't go
escape
anyway.
anywhere. So I'm
Yeah.
here at your disposal. So
Great.
let me know. But anyway,
Okay.
wishing everybody a safe and peaceful weekend, and take care, and let's be in touch. All the best. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Francis.
Bye bye.
Good night.
Yay, congratulations, Laura. It's Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
Wow, what a journey. Oh,
Yeah.
just terrific. Such a great spirit that you presented it all with. And yeah, you think on your feet great, which is something we always knew.
I'm always grateful for that.
Yeah, and you're also very patient as the committee is in absentia, and like that's taking a long time. And anyway, you did great.
I had a dream that it was going to take a long time, and I'm not going to share the details of it, but I dreamt in this defense that I was going to be waiting for like forever for the committee to come back, and it was this kind of nightmare, but that's not what happened. But I definitely was anticipating some of that, so it's good. Unless there's any questions, or well, yeah, what happens next, Jake? What do we do?
I will send you the little list we've made of revision requests, and
okay,
it's pretty, I think, and you and I can talk about it if you have any questions and
okay,
and so forth. But yep, we'll move from there. So, but for today, this has been an event. I've made you the host now, so if you want to stay on, you can.
Okay.
But
all right.
Yeah.
It seems like everyone's.
Laura.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your support and for your belief in magic.
It's really a wonderful piece. And so I didn't get to say this during the when we were all together and it was still going on, but it's beautifully written, and so it's just a delight to read a work of scholarship that's also eloquent and engaging and magical in its own way. So
thanks. Good. Good to hear.
Amen.
I'm off.
Okay, unless there's any other questions, I too should probably try and take a nap because I didn't sleep much last night.
I get it.
Okay, all right.
Well
thank you all.
deserved.
Thank you all so much for watching. Yeah.
Sleep well.
Congratulations, Laura.
Thank you.
You wake up the doctor.
And stay well and peaceful during this challenge that we're all in right now. Bye.
Yes. Bye bye. Congratulations,
Bye.
Doc.
I'll send you
Thanks.